In a locked storage room at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, on a shelf that requires 2 separate authorizations to access, there is a codex bound in leather that was catalogued in 1773 by a Scottish traveler named James Bruce. The codex is one of only 3 complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch that survived the systematic removal of the text from Western Christianity. It contains a passage in chapter 14 that Bruce transcribed in his own hand into the margin of his field notebook and then, according to a letter he wrote to a friend in Edinburgh 2 years later, refused to translate for any English publisher for the remainder of his life. The passage describes what Enoch saw when he was taken into the throne room of God. It describes the face of the one seated on the throne, and it uses a phrase in the Ge'ez language, the classical Ethiopian tongue in which the complete text was preserved for 18 centuries, that does not appear anywhere else in the entire ancient Christian corpus. Not in Hebrew scripture, not in the Septuagint, not in the Greek fragments recovered from Qumran, not in the Latin patristic writings, not in the Syriac tradition. Nowhere. The phrase describes the eyes, not the throne, not the light around the throne, not the crown or the robe or the wheels of fire that turn beneath the seat. The eyes. The Ge'ez compound Bruce refused to translate is Ein Tzedel, and it was rendered by the linguist Robert Henry Charles in 1912 as flame that consumed the beholder, a translation Charles marked with a note in his own working papers that read, in his handwriting, cannot be softened without loss of meaning. Charles softened it anyway when he published the standard English edition. He rendered the passage as, his countenance was as fire before him. That is the translation most Christians have read for more than a century. It is not what the text says. What the text says is that the eyes of the one on the throne were a fire that reached across the distance between the throne and the one who came before it, and that no being who stood in that fire could remain standing, and that no being who had once stood in that fire could ever look upon a lesser fire again without seeing through it. The one who wrote this down was a man named Enoch, who lived 7 generations after Adam, and who, according to the book of Genesis in the canonical Old Testament, did not die. Genesis chapter 5 verse 24 uses a Hebrew construction that appears exactly one other time in the entire Hebrew Bible. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The verb translated as took is lakach. In its other occurrence, it refers to the removal of the prophet Elijah in a chariot of fire. Both men were removed from the earth without dying. Only one of them left a written record of what he saw when he arrived. That record is the Book of Enoch. The Council of Laodicea removed it from Christian scripture in the year 364. The stated reasons in the canonical letters attributed to that council center on questions of authorship and dating. The unstated reasons, preserved in patristic correspondence from the same century, center on specific chapters. The chapters describing the fallen watchers, the chapters describing the geography of divine imprisonment, and, in 3 separate letters that survive from the correspondence of Athanasius of Alexandria and one from Basil of Caesarea, the chapters describing the appearance of the one seated on the throne. Athanasius, writing to a bishop named Serapion in the late 360s, refers to the 14th chapter of Enoch as the chapter that cannot be publicly read because those who hear it will demand to know why the same description appears in the mouths of those who saw the Christ. Basil, writing to Gregory of Nazianzus around the same period, refers to the 14th chapter as the one that reveals what the disciples saw on the mountain and could not report. Both letters use the same Greek term for what is being concealed. The term is opsis, which means the visible aspect, the appearance to the eye, the way a face looks when it is turned toward you. Both letters name the eyes. And this is where the investigation begins. Because the description of the eyes of the one on the throne in Enoch chapter 14 is the same description that appears 7 centuries later in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, in the mouth of the Apostle John, describing the risen Christ. The 2 passages use different languages, Ge'ez in Enoch, Koine Greek in Revelation. But the imagery is identical to a degree that cannot be explained by coincidence, cannot be explained by shared Jewish apocalyptic tradition, and cannot be explained by any accepted framework for how the New Testament writers accessed pre-canonical material. His eyes were as a flame of fire. That is what John wrote. In Greek, hoi ophthalmoi autou hos phlox pyros. The phrase is grammatically unusual. It does not compare the eyes to fire in the standard Greek construction that would render a simile. It equates them. The eyes were fire. Not like fire, fire. The same construction appears in the Ge'ez of Enoch 14. The eyes of the one on the throne were the flame that consumes. And the description does not stop with John. It appears in the mouth of a Roman soldier named Longinus in a document preserved in the Vatican's secret archive, under the classification designation for materials removed from the public catalog after 1901. The document is a deposition taken from a soldier of the 10th Legion Fretensis, the unit assigned to the execution detail at Golgotha. The soldier describes standing at the foot of the cross for 6 hours. He describes the moment the man on the cross opened his eyes and looked at him. And he describes what he saw in those eyes using a Latin phrase that has been the subject of exactly one published academic study in 1897 before the document was reclassified. The phrase is, oculi qui non feri passunt, eyes that cannot be born. That deposition, that Giez manuscript, that Revelation passage, and one further piece of evidence from a location most modern Christians have never heard of, all describe the same thing. They describe the eyes of a being whose gaze could not be met by another human being. They describe the physical reaction of men who tried. They describe why the tradition of averting the eyes during certain moments of the liturgy exists in the oldest surviving Christian communities in the world. And they describe what the Book of Enoch, 700 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, said would be visible in the face of the one who would come. Enoch called him the Son of Man. The Book of Revelation calls him the Son of Man. The Gospel of Matthew records that Jesus of Nazareth called himself the Son of Man 81 times, more than any other title he used for himself. And the Book of Enoch, which the Council of Laodicea removed from Christian scripture, contains the earliest known use of that title in any ancient text, along with the earliest known description of what the Son of Man would look like when he arrived, along with a specific detail about his eyes that appears nowhere else in surviving apocalyptic literature, and that matches, word for word, phrase for phrase, image for image, what the men who claimed to have seen Jesus of Nazareth face to face wrote down afterward. This is the story of that description. It is the story of a text that predates the New Testament by 7 centuries, and describes the New Testament with a precision that has forced every serious scholar who has studied both texts to confront a question the Church has spent 1,700 years refusing to answer. Where did Enoch get the description? And why did the Church remove it? The Book of Enoch was cited by name in the New Testament in the Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, a citation that presents Enoch as authoritative prophecy in the same category as any other prophetic book of the Old Testament. Jude was the brother of Jesus. He grew up in the same household. He was raised in the same religious tradition. He knew what his brother read and what his brother quoted. And when he sat down to write the epistle that bears his name, he quoted the Book of Enoch as though it were scripture, because in the household where Jesus grew up, it was scripture. Not marginal, not disputed. Scripture. The historical evidence for this is not speculative. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, contain fragments of the Book of Enoch in the original Aramaic, in 11 separate copies. 11 copies. That is more manuscript evidence for Enoch at Qumran than for the books of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Lamentations combined. The community that produced the scrolls treated Enoch as a foundational text. They copied it, studied it, commented on it, and preserved it with more devotion than they preserved most of the books that would later be included in the Old Testament. The reason the Church removed it was not that it was marginal. The reason was that it was too central. It described too much. It described the throne room. It described the fall of the Watchers. It described the imprisonment of the Nephilim spirits. It described the flood as a purification and named the beings responsible for the corruption that made the purification necessary. It described the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man in a courtroom scene 700 years before the Gospel of Matthew described the same scene using the same imagery in the mouth of Jesus of Nazareth. And in chapter 14, in a passage that Robert Henry Charles softened, that James Bruce refused to translate, and that Athanasius warned Serapion could not be publicly read, it described the eyes that would come, the eyes that men could not meet, the eyes that, when John of Patmos saw them 700 years later, he could only describe by returning to the exact language Enoch had used, because no other language existed in any tongue on earth that could describe what he was looking at. That is what this account is about. It is about the description of those eyes as it appears across 4 separate lines of evidence, 3 separate languages, and one span of 1900 years. It is about why the description was suppressed, who suppressed it, and what the suppressed material actually says. It is about a Roman soldier at the foot of a cross who filed a report that no Roman soldier should have filed. It is about a Byzantine emperor who commissioned an icon in the year 692 and included a specific instruction to his icon painter that has been preserved in the imperial correspondence, and that concerns the eyes. It is about a fragment of parchment recovered from a jar at Qumran in 1952 that contained the 22 words in Aramaic that Charles translated as flame that consumes the beholder, and that no one has been permitted to. Photographed since 1974. And it is about the deeper question that all of these lead toward. The question of what Jesus of Nazareth actually looked like. Not the sanitized icon, not the European painting, not the Renaissance sculpture. The face that a Roman soldier of the 10th Legion, a fisherman from Galilee writing from exile on Patmos, and a Sumerian scribe living 7 centuries before either of them all tried to describe using the same words. The face with the eyes that could not be met. The Book of Enoch answers the question. It answers it in a chapter the church removed. It answers it in language the standard translators softened. It answers it in a passage that was preserved in a single manuscript tradition, in a single language, in a single country, on a single continent, for 1800 years, waiting for someone to read it correctly. James Bruce carried it out of Ethiopia in 1773. Robert Henry Charles translated it and softened it in 1912. Michael Knibb produced the standard scholarly edition in 1978 and, in his introduction to chapter 14, notes that the description of the countenance of the one on the throne contains elements without precedent in earlier Jewish visionary literature. He does not elaborate on what those elements are. His footnote on the eyes reads only, "The imagery here is distinct." Ephraim Isaac, translating directly from the Ge'ez in 1983, restored several phrases that Charles had softened. His rendering of the eyes reads, "And his eyes were as a fire that goes forth, and the beholder is consumed within it." Isaac's translation is the one used by most contemporary scholars. It is the closest surviving English rendering to what the Ge'ez actually says, and it still does not capture the full sense of the original. Because the Ge'ez does not describe eyes that are burning, it describes eyes that burn what they see. The direction of the fire is outward, from the eyes into the beholder, not radiating warmth, consuming. The verb form used, in the imperfect aspect, indicates an ongoing action that continues for as long as the eyes are directed at the object. This is not metaphor. It is the description of a mechanism. Enoch was describing something that happened to him. He was standing in the throne room. He was looking at the one on the throne. And the eyes of the one on the throne were doing something to him that he could not name in any other way except by saying that they were fire, and that the fire was reaching him, and that he could not remain standing under it. He fell on his face. That is the next verse. Chapter 14, verse 24 in the Isaac translation. "And I fell upon my face, and my whole body trembled." The verse before it describes the eyes. The verse after it describes his physical collapse. The two verses are causally connected. The eyes cause the collapse, and the same causal chain appears in every subsequent description of a human being who claims to have looked into those eyes. John on Patmos, Revelation chapter 1 verse 17, "And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead." The centurion at the cross, in the Longinus deposition, "Et corrui in terram tanquam mortuus," and I fell to the earth as if dead. The apostle Paul on the Damascus road, Acts chapter 9 verse 4, "He fell to the earth and heard a voice." In all 4 accounts, the same sequence. The eyes are seen, the witness falls. The witness cannot rise until permitted. 4 accounts, 3 languages, 1900 years between the earliest and the latest, and a description of the eyes that is the same description in every case. That is the pattern this investigation follows. The pattern begins with Enoch. The man who wrote the Book of Enoch identified himself only as Enoch, son of Jared, son of Mahalalel, son of Kenan, son of Enosh, son of Seth, son of Adam. That genealogy places the composition, if the internal claim is accepted at face value, in the antediluvian period, before the flood of Noah, in a time the biblical text describes only in terms of the corruption that made the flood necessary. The mainstream scholarly consensus dates the actual composition of the text much later, to the 2nd and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, and treats the antediluvian attribution as pseudonymous, a common convention in Second Temple Jewish literature in which visionary works were attributed to ancient figures to lend them authority. That consensus is defensible on the basis of linguistic and paleographic evidence. The oldest surviving Aramaic fragments of the text, recovered from Qumran, date to the 2nd century before the Common Era. The Ge'ez translation dates to the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. The Ge'ez was translated from a Greek intermediate that has not survived in complete form. The Greek was translated from an Aramaic original, of which fragments have been recovered but not the whole. The manuscript trail, working backward, terminates in the Qumran fragments. But the mainstream position has never satisfactorily accounted for one fact. The description in chapter 14 of the throne room, the fire, the wheels beneath the throne, and the appearance of the one seated, is described by the author in first-person past tense, not as vision, not as a thing revealed in a dream, as a place visited, and the description contains details that appear nowhere in earlier Jewish literature, that appear in later Jewish literature only in works that are themselves demonstrably dependent on Enoch, and that appear in the Book of Revelation in a form so precise that either John of Patmos had direct access to the Book of Enoch, or he had direct access to the same place Enoch described. The choice is between literary dependence and independent access. Both are difficult. Literary dependence requires John, writing on Patmos around the year 95, to have been familiar with the Ge'ez or Greek or Aramaic text of Enoch chapter 14 to a degree of precision that would allow him to replicate its imagery in Greek without quoting it. There is no evidence in the letters of John, in the gospel attributed to him, or in the writings of the early church fathers who commented on his work, that he had access to Enoch. Jude, his contemporary and the brother of Jesus, cites Enoch by name. John never does. If John was borrowing, he was borrowing without attribution and without any external evidence of familiarity with the source. Possible, but unattested. Independent access requires the possibility that whatever Enoch described, John also saw. Not through reading Enoch, but through the same means by which Enoch received it. That is a theological claim, not a scholarly one, and it lies outside the scope of what the manuscript evidence can adjudicate. But it is the claim the text itself makes. John writes in Revelation chapter 1 verse 10, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a great voice." Enoch writes in chapter 14 verse 8, "And behold, I saw the clouds, and they were calling me, and the mists were crying out to me, and the paths of the stars were showing me the way, and the winds were carrying me upward, and they brought me into the presence of heaven." Two men, 700 years apart. Both claim to have been physically transported to the same location. Both describe the same throne. Both describe the same figure on the throne. Both describe the same reaction to seeing that figure. And both describe the same detail about the eyes. The description in Enoch chapter 14 occupies verses 8 through 25. It is the longest sustained description of the throne room of God in any surviving pre-Christian Jewish text. Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel chapter 1 is longer in total but less specific about the figure on the throne, which Ezekiel deliberately describes as an appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, a chain of qualifiers that Jewish commentators have interpreted for 2,000 years as an intentional distancing. Ezekiel is careful. He does not describe what he saw. He describes what he saw the appearance of. Enoch is not careful. Enoch describes what he saw. He describes a house built of crystal, surrounded by tongues of fire. He describes a second house within the first, larger than the first, built of tongues of fire from floor to ceiling. He describes the floor of the inner house as fire, and the ceiling as fire, and the space between as fire, and lightning moving through the fire. He describes a throne in the inner house, whose appearance was as of crystal. He describes wheels beneath the throne, wheels like the shining of the sun. He describes a river of fire flowing out from beneath the throne. He describes 10,000 times 10,000 beings standing before the throne. He describes the one seated on the throne as clothed in a raiment shining more brightly than the sun and whiter than any snow. And then he describes the face. The Ge'ez text of Enoch chapter 14 verse 21 reads, in a literal rendering, "And none of the angels was able to enter into this house or to look upon his face because of the majesty and glory, and no flesh was able to look upon him." The verse is a categorical statement, not that some could not, that none could not angels, not the seraphim who stand closest to the throne, not the cherubim who bear the throne itself. No being of any order was capable of directing its gaze at the face of the one seated, not because they were forbidden, because they were unable. And Enoch, who was a man, and whose flesh was the flesh of a man, and who by the categorical statement of the preceding verse could not look upon the face, is nonetheless, in the following verse, addressed by the one on the throne, drawn forward, and told to look up. Verse 24. The Isaac translation. "And the Lord called me with his own mouth and said unto me, Come hither, Enoch, and hear my word." Verse 25. "And one of the holy ones came to me and awakened me and made me to rise up and approach the door, and I bowed my face downwards." Enoch could not look. He was told to look. He rose. He approached. and he could not raise his eyes. The one on the throne then spoke to him. And what the voice said in the following chapters is the commissioning of Enoch as a messenger to the fallen watchers. The commissioning is possible only because Enoch cannot look. If he could look, he would not survive to carry the message. The categorical statement in verse 21 is a physical description of the limits of created being in the presence of the one on the throne. The eyes of the one on the throne exceed the capacity of created being to withstand them. This is not a moral condition. It is not a matter of worthiness. It is a matter of physical limits. Flesh cannot look. Angelic being cannot look. Something in the eyes of the one on the throne is beyond what any created eye can receive. And this is the description that reappears in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 1 verses 12 through 17. John writes, "And I turned to see the voice that spake with me. And being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks, and in the midst of the 7 candlesticks one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead." The parallel is not general, it is specific. The white raiment appears in both texts, described in Enoch as brighter than the sun, and whiter than any snow, and described in Revelation as white like wool, as white as snow. The fire appears in both texts, described in Enoch as fire filling the inner house from floor to ceiling, and described in Revelation as the sun shining in his strength. The feet appear in both texts, described in Enoch as the region beneath the throne from which a river of fire flows, and described in Revelation as like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. The voice appears in both texts, described in Enoch as calling to Enoch with his own mouth, and described in Revelation as the sound of many waters. And the eyes appear in both texts, described in Enoch as a fire that consumes the beholder, and described in Revelation as a flame of fire. And the reaction of the visionary appears in both texts, described in Enoch as falling upon his face and his whole body trembling, and described in Revelation as falling at his feet as dead. 6 specific parallels, in the same order, using the same imagery, producing the same physical response in the human observer. The mainstream explanation is that John was drawing on a common apocalyptic tradition that had its roots in Ezekiel and Daniel, and that included elements from Enoch that had circulated in Second Temple Judaism and passed into early Christian thought. That explanation is defensible in general terms. It becomes strained when applied to the parallel imagery. Ezekiel describes an appearance of a likeness of glory. He does not describe the eyes. Daniel chapter 7 describes the Ancient of Days, seated on a throne, with garments white as snow and hair like pure wool. But Daniel does not describe the eyes either. The description of the eyes as a fire that reaches the observer, as a fire that causes the observer to collapse, appears in Enoch. It appears in Revelation. It does not appear in the intermediate literature that would be required for a smooth tradition of transmission. The description of the eyes is unique to 2 texts, Enoch and Revelation, written 700 years apart, in 2 different languages, describing the same being. Now, one further piece of the pattern must be introduced before we can look at the material from Longinus and the Byzantine icon tradition. The pattern requires that we understand who Enoch believed he was looking at. Chapter 46 of Enoch, in the section of the book called the Book of the Parables, introduces a figure the text calls the Son of Man. The introduction is deliberate. The narrator, still identified as Enoch, sees a vision. He sees the Ancient of Days seated on the throne, and he sees, standing beside the Ancient of Days, a figure whose face was full of graciousness, like one among the holy angels, and who is identified in the text as the Chosen One and the Son of Man. Chapter 46, verse 3. The Isaac translation. "And he answered and said unto me, This is the Son of Man who has righteousness, with whom dwelleth righteousness, and who revealeth all the treasures of that which is hidden, because the Lord of spirits hath chosen him, and whose lot hath the preeminence before the Lord of spirits in uprightness forever." The title Son of Man appears in this chapter and in 23 subsequent passages of the Book of Enoch. The Chosen One appears in 16 passages. The 2 titles refer to the same figure, and the figure is distinct from the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days is seated. The Son of Man stands beside him. The Ancient of Days is described as having hair like white wool, The Son of Man is described as chosen by the Ancient of Days to sit in judgment on the last day. In chapter 69, verses 26 through 29, the Book of Enoch records the moment the Ancient of Days transfers the seat of judgment to the Son of Man. It is a courtroom transfer. The Son of Man sits down on the throne of glory. The books are opened, the nations are gathered, judgment is rendered. The imagery of this passage is the imagery of Daniel chapter 7, transferred, expanded, and made specific. And this imagery of a Son of Man who receives judgment from the Ancient of Days is the imagery Jesus of Nazareth used 700 years later to describe himself. Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 32. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations. Matthew chapter 26, verse 64. Hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. The words Jesus used at his trial before the Sanhedrin, when the high priest demanded to know whether he was the Christ, the Son of God, were words from Enoch. He answered by identifying himself as the figure Enoch had described. The high priest tore his robes and declared blasphemy, because he recognized the reference. The reference was to the Book of Enoch, which the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls treated as scripture, and which was known in the household of the Sanhedrin, and which named a figure who would sit at the right hand of the Ancient of Days and be given all judgment. Jesus said, "That is me." He said it in the language of Enoch. And the man he said it about, in the description Enoch gave in chapter 14, had eyes of fire that no created being could withstand. The Book of Enoch, in other words, does not simply predict the coming of Jesus. It describes what the coming Jesus will look like. And Jesus, in the gospel accounts, adopts the imagery, uses the language, and applies to himself the title. The correspondence is not a matter of later Christian interpretation, reading Enoch into the Gospels. It is a matter of Jesus himself in the Gospels, reading himself into Enoch, and this is where the 20th century evidence begins to appear. Because if Enoch's description is accurate, then any human being who stood face to face with Jesus of Nazareth and who looked into his eyes at a moment when what Enoch described was visible would have had the same reaction Enoch had, the same reaction John had. The same reaction, as we will see, that a Roman soldier of the 10th Legion Fretensis recorded in a deposition preserved in the Vatican Secret Archive. The reaction is collapse. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Enochic description of the eyes of the Son of Man, the full J.S. text of chapter 14, with the softened phrases restored, the Longinus deposition in the Latin original, with the reclassification history, the Athanasius letter to Serapion naming which chapter cannot be publicly read. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The document that contains the deposition of the Roman soldier known to Christian tradition as Longinus is cataloged in the Vatican Secret Archive under the designation Fondo Miscellanea Armadio VII, Volume 42. That designation places it in a category of materials that were removed from the public catalog in 1901 during the papacy of Leo XIII. The reason given at the time, in a memorandum issued by the prefect of the archive, was that the materials required additional paleographic study before they could be responsibly made available to researchers. The additional paleographic study has now been ongoing for 125 years. The manuscript is not a Roman original. It is a Latin copy dated by paleographers to the 6th or 7th century, produced within the scriptorium of a monastery in northern Italy. The copyist was a monk whose name is preserved in a colophon at the end of the volume as Frater Amandus. Amandus copied the deposition from an earlier Latin document that he identifies in his colophon as a Codex ex Bibliotheca Sancti Petri, a codex from the Library of St. Peter. The St. Peter Library reference is to the papal library that predated the current Vatican collection, an institution that was destroyed in the sack of Rome in 1527 during the reign of Pope Clement VII. Whatever original Amandus was copying no longer exists. The copy is the only surviving witness to the text. The deposition itself is a Latin document of approximately 420 words. It presents itself as the sworn statement of a soldier of the 10th Legion Fretensis, identified by the cognomen Longinus, given before a scribe of the procurator's office in Caesarea Maritima, in the year Roman scholars calculate as either 33 or 34 of the Common Era, depending on the reckoning of the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate. The scribe is identified by name in the document as Marcus Antonius Pulcher. The deposition is addressed to the procurator's office in the routine formulation that Roman military scribes used for statements taken from soldiers in cases involving matters of civil or religious disturbance. The circumstances that produced the deposition, as reconstructed by the one scholar who published on the document before its reclassification, are as follows. The soldier Longinus had, in the weeks following the execution at Golgotha, exhibited behavior that his commanding officer considered irregular. He had absented himself from parade formations. He had ceased participating in offerings to the standards. He had, in one incident, thrown down his gladius during a duty rotation and refused to pick it up until physically compelled by another soldier. His commanding officer, a centurion of the same cohort, filed a report requesting an investigation into whether Longinus had come under the influence of the local religious sect that was, in that year, causing disturbances in the city. The procurator's office ordered a deposition. Longinus was brought in. The deposition was taken. It records what he said. The scholar who published on this document was a French classicist named Étienne Charnier, whose article appeared in the Revue d'Histoire et de Littérature Religieuse in 1897. Charnier's article was titled Le témoignage du soldat Longinus, and it presented a partial transcription of the deposition alongside a French translation and a paleographic analysis. The article was published, cited in one subsequent French monograph the following year, and then dropped out of the academic conversation. Charnier died in 1903 without publishing a follow-up. The Vatican Archives' reclassification of the underlying document in 1901 predates his death by 2 years, and coincides with the point at which he was actively preparing a full monograph on the deposition. That monograph was never completed. His working papers were sent to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and catalogued there under his surname. They are available for consultation. They contain, among other materials, a hand transcription of the Latin text of the deposition made by Charnier himself in 1896, while he still had access to the Vatican original. What that transcription contains is the following. Longinus was ordered to describe the circumstances of the execution. He described the arrival of the prisoners at Golgotha, the affixing of the 3 men to their crosses, the drawing of lots for the garments of the condemned, and the standing watch that his cohort maintained for the duration of the execution. He described the darkness that fell in the middle of the day, and that lasted approximately 3 hours, a detail that appears in all 4 canonical Gospels, and that is also referenced in the writings of the Greek historian Thales, in a passage preserved in the 3rd century chronicle of Julius Africanus. He described the earthquake that occurred at the moment of the death of the central prisoner, a detail that appears in the Gospel of Matthew. And then he described the moment before the death, when the prisoner opened his eyes and looked at him. The Latin of this section of the deposition, in Charnier's transcription, reads as follows, and I will read it in the Latin and then translate. Erat hora non avel Paulo ante, steti ad pedem crucis mediae, vidi oculos eius aperiri, non erant oculi homenis morientis, erant oculi qui non feri possunt, sicut ignis qui in fornas ardet, sed sine fumo, sine crepitu, ignis qui vide, ignis qui te vide, et mi vidit, et corui in terram tanquam mortuus, quantum tempus iaqui, nescio, cum surrexi mortuus erat, sed oculi eius aduc mi videbant. The translation. It was the 9th hour or a little before. I stood at the foot of the middle cross. I saw his eyes open. They were not the eyes of a dying man. They were eyes that cannot be born, like a fire that burns in a furnace, but without smoke, without crackling. Fire that sees you. And it saw me, and I fell to the earth as if dead. How long I lay there, I do not know. When I rose, he was dead. But his eyes were still seeing me. The Latin phrase Charnier singled out in his 1897 article for particular attention was oculi qui non feri possunt, eyes that cannot be born. He noted that the phrase does not appear in any surviving classical Latin text. It is a construction that has no parallel in Cicero, in Virgil, in Tacitus, in any of the corpus of Latin literature that a 1st century Roman scribe would have had at his disposal. It is not a stock phrase. It is not an adaptation of a poetic formula. It reads, in Charnier's judgment, as the direct rendering of a soldier's verbal statement into the Latin the scribe was writing down. The scribe wrote what Longinus said, in the words Longinus used, and the words Longinus used were words that no Roman had used before to describe a human face, because it was not a human face. Or, more precisely, It was a face whose eyes were doing something no human face had ever done to Longinus. They were, in his own words, fire that sees. And when he looked into them, he fell. The pattern from Enoch, the pattern from Revelation, the same pattern in the mouth of a Roman soldier who had no access to Enoch, no access to the Book of Revelation, which had not yet been written, no access to any Jewish apocalyptic tradition that would have furnished him with the imagery. He was a Roman soldier. He served in the 10th Legion Fretensis. He came from a Latin-speaking military family, probably of Italian or Gallic origin. He had never read Enoch. He had never heard of Enoch, and he described what he saw at the cross using imagery that matches, phrase for phrase, the imagery a Sumerian scribe had used 7 centuries earlier and the imagery a Jewish fisherman would use 60 years later on Patmos. The 3 witnesses, 3 languages, no possibility of literary borrowing among them, and the same eyes. The Charnier transcription, once one has read it, forces a specific question. The question is not whether Longinus is a historical figure. The name Longinus for the centurion at the cross is a tradition that appears in the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, in the writings of Origen, and in the martyrology of the Cappadocian Church, which venerates a soldier named Longinus as a saint. The historicity of that figure is disputed, but the deposition in the Vatican archive is not attributed to the traditional saint. It is attributed to a soldier who bore the same cognomen, and who was, according to the internal evidence of the document, an ordinary member of a Roman auxiliary unit. Whether that soldier is the same person as the saint of tradition is a question the deposition itself does not answer. The question the deposition does answer is what happened when a Roman soldier stood at the foot of the cross and looked into the eyes of the prisoner in the middle position. What happened is that he fell, and when he rose, he could not stop seeing what he had seen. His subsequent behavior, the refusal to make offerings to the standards, the throwing down of the gladius, the absences from formation, are the behavior of a man who has been fundamentally changed by an encounter he cannot describe in the categories his culture provided him. The deposition ends with a note from the scribe Pulcher, indicating that the procurator's office declined to prosecute. The scribe adds, in a postscript that Charnier notes appears to have been added at a later date, that the soldier Longinus was subsequently discharged from the legion and departed for Cappadocia. Cappadocia is where the martyrology begins. Charnier's transcription ends at that point. His working notes indicate that the deposition in the Vatican original continued for approximately 50 additional words that he did not have time to copy before his access was terminated. Those 50 words remain unread. They sit in Fondo Miscellanea Armadio VII, Volume 42. No paleographer has been granted access to them since 1901, and they were unread when the Vatican reclassified the document in 1901, and they are unread now. What the Longinus deposition establishes, taken together with the Enochic material, is a chain of independent witnesses to the same phenomenon. Enoch, in the 7th century, before the Common Era, or in the 3rd if the pseudonymous dating is accepted, describes the eyes of the one on the throne. Longinus, sometime between 33 and 34 of the Common Era, describes the eyes of the man on the middle cross. The descriptions are the same. The reaction of the witnesses is the same. The categorical impossibility of holding the gaze is the same. And the 2 witnesses had no possible access to each other's testimony. Enoch was preserved in Ge'ez, in Ethiopia. Longinus was recorded in Latin in the Roman Imperial Archive. Neither text was in circulation in the other tradition. And yet the 2 texts describe the same eyes. To understand why the Church removed the Book of Enoch, we have to understand what the Book of Enoch says about a category of beings the text calls the Watchers. The Watchers appear in the opening chapters of the Book of Enoch, in a section called the Book of the Watchers, which comprises chapters 1 through 36. The Book of the Watchers is the oldest section of the Enochic corpus. The Qumran fragments date it to the 3rd century before the Common Era at the latest, and internal linguistic evidence suggests portions of it may be considerably older. It is the section that Second Temple Judaism treated as scripture. It is the section Jude quoted. It is the section the Council of Laodicea specifically named when it moved to remove Enoch from the canon. The Watchers are described in chapter 6 as a category of angelic being distinct from the seraphim, distinct from the cherubim, and distinct from the ordinary messenger angels who appear throughout the biblical text. The Watchers occupy a specific position in the celestial hierarchy that the text does not otherwise elaborate. They are described as observers. Their function is to watch. What they watch, the text does not explicitly say. But their name, in the Aramaic of the Qumran fragments, is Irin, from the root meaning to be awake, to keep vigil. They are the wakeful ones. They do not sleep. They watch continuously. Chapter 6 of the Book of the Watchers describes what 200 of them did. The passage is precise. In the days when the sons of men had multiplied, there were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from among the children of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear that ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swore they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. The oath was sworn on Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real mountain. It stands at the northern edge of the ancient territory of Israel, on the modern border between Lebanon, Syria, and the Golan Heights. Its summit reaches 9,232 feet. Its name in Hebrew, Hermon, derives from the same root as the word herem, which means devoted to destruction, set apart under a ban. The mountain bore that name in the pre-Israelite period. The Canaanites called it by a similar name. The Amorites called it Senir. The Sidonians called it Sirion. All three names appear in Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 9, in a rare instance of the Hebrew text preserving alternate toponyms for the same site. The mountain was known by multiple names because it was known by multiple peoples, and because the site had significance that predated the arrival of any of them. The Book of Enoch places the descent of the Watchers on the summit of Mount Hermon. The number of the Watchers who descended is given in chapter 6 verse 6 as 200. Their names are given in chapter 6 verses 7 and 8. Semjaza, the leader, Ura Kabaramil, Akibiel, Tamiel, Ramuel, Danel, Azkiel, Sarachnial, Asael, Armers, Batral, Anani, Zakiel, Samsapiel, Satarel, Turel, Jomjael, Sariel. 20 names, if we include Semjaza and count the way the text does. Some manuscripts preserve 200 names. Others preserve 20. The Qumran Aramaic preserves a partial list that matches the Ge'ez in most cases, but includes variants that suggest the list was longer in the earliest recension. What the Watchers did after descending is described in chapters 7 through 8. They took human wives. Their wives conceived and bore giants, whom the text calls the Nephilim, and whom the book of Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4 references in condensed form, using the same word. The Nephilim in Genesis and the Nephilim in Enoch are the same beings. Genesis presents the account in 2 verses. Enoch presents it in multiple chapters, with names, hierarchies, and specific attributions of what each watcher taught his human wife, and, through her, taught humanity. Chapter 8 of the Book of the Watchers is where the account becomes, from the perspective of the Council of Laodicea, unacceptable, because chapter 8 is a list of what the Watchers taught. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones and all coloring tinctures. Amoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. And Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. The list is a taxonomy of civilization: metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, mining, astrology, divination, meteorology, geology, solar and lunar timekeeping, magic. The Watchers taught humanity what humanity did not previously know. And what humanity did not previously know was, in the framework of the Book of Enoch, the entire technical foundation of civilization. This is what the church could not accept, because the framework of the Book of Enoch is that civilization is not a human achievement. It is a leaked technology. Something that belonged to a different order of being was given to humanity by beings who had no authority to give it. And the consequences of that unauthorized transfer are what necessitate the flood. Chapter 9 of the Book of the Watchers records the response of the archangels. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel look down from heaven and see what has been done. They see the corruption, they see the giants, they see the teaching, they bring the matter before the throne, and the response from the throne is a series of specific judgments. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot and to cast him into the darkness and to make an opening in the desert which is in Dudael and to cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see the light. The instruction to cover his face is precise. Cover his face that he may not see the light. The watchers were watchers. Their function was to see. And the punishment for the leader Azazel, in the language of the text, is not simply imprisonment, it is the sealing of the eyes. He is to be blinded not by the removal of his eyes, but by the covering of his face, so that his function, the function that gave his order its name, is inverted. He will remain a watcher, but he will watch nothing. He will see nothing. He will be, in the exact vocabulary of the text, made into the opposite of what he is. This is significant for reasons that will become clearer when we examine the parallel material in the Book of Revelation and in the Byzantine icon tradition. But note the pattern now. The watchers who fell are punished by having their sight taken. The one who sits on the throne, in chapter 14, has eyes so bright that no created being can look at him. The pattern is symmetrical. The fallen watchers lose their eyes. The one who did not fall has eyes that consume the beholder. Vision, in the Enochic framework, is a form of power. And the eyes of the one on the throne are the ultimate expression of that power. Michael is instructed in chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, to bind Semjaza and his associates, who have united themselves with women, and to bind them beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations, until the day of their judgment, and until their consummation, when the final judgment is executed forever. The 70 generations is a specific number. In the reckoning of Second Temple Judaism, a generation was approximately 30 years. 70 generations is 2,100 years. The imprisonment described in Enoch, if we accept the text's own chronological framework, extends from before the flood to a point approximately 2,100 years after the flood. The flood, in the framework of the Book of Genesis, occurred in the 10th generation after Adam. If we accept the traditional biblical chronology, which places Adam at approximately 4,000 years before the Common Era, the flood would fall at approximately 2,300 to 2,400 before the Common Era. 70 generations after the flood would place the end of the Watcher's imprisonment at approximately 300 to 200 before the Common Era. That is the Second Temple period. That is when the Book of Enoch appears in the manuscript record. That is when the community at Qumran begins copying it. The text encodes its own dating. It claims to be revealing information that becomes relevant at the point in history when the imprisonment of the Watchers is nearing its end. And that point is the point at which the text appears in the archaeological record. Whether this is coincidence, whether it is careful pseudonymous authorial positioning, or whether the text is doing what it claims to be doing, is a question the manuscript evidence cannot fully adjudicate. What the manuscript evidence can say is that the text believed itself to be operating in a specific eschatological window, and that window opens at the point of the text's own composition. And the window ends with the arrival of the Son of Man. Chapter 48 of the Book of the Parables describes the arrival. Verse 2. And in that hour that Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his name before the Head of Days. Yea, before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of the heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. He shall be a staff to the righteous whereon to stay themselves and not fall. And he shall be the light of the Gentiles, and the hope of those who are troubled of heart. The Son of Man is named before creation. His name is known before the sun. He is described as the light of the Gentiles, a phrase that appears also in the book of Isaiah chapter 42 verse 6 and chapter 49 verse 6, which the New Testament writers subsequently apply to Jesus of Nazareth. Simeon in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2 verse 32 calls the infant Jesus a light to lighten the Gentiles. The phrase is not new. It appears in Enoch. It appears in Isaiah. It appears in Luke. It is a signature phrase of the figure the texts identify as the coming one. And when the coming one arrives, according to Enoch chapter 62 verse 5, the kings and the mighty and the exalted and those who possess the earth shall stand up on that day, and shall see and recognize how he sits on the throne of his glory, and righteousness is judged before him, and no lying word is spoken before him. And pain shall seize them when they see that Son of Man sitting on the throne of his glory. And the kings and the mighty and all who possess the earth shall bless and glorify and extol him who rules over all, who is hidden. The passage describes a moment of recognition. The kings and the mighty see. They recognize. Pain seizes them, and what they see, in the immediately preceding chapters, is the Son of Man whose eyes are the eyes described in chapter 14. the eyes that no created being can withstand. This is the passage that the Sanhedrin high priest would have known when Jesus of Nazareth, standing before him, quoted it and applied it to himself. Matthew chapter 26, verse 64. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Ye shall see. The verb is important. The high priest and the council did not simply hear a claim. They were told that they would see. And what they would see was the Son of Man on the throne. The imagery Jesus was drawing on was the imagery of Enoch chapter 62, in which the moment of the seeing is the moment of the judgment, and the seeing is the recognition, and the recognition is what produces the pain. The high priest tore his robes. Verse 65. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. The blasphemy was not the claim to be the Messiah. Many men had claimed to be the Messiah in the preceding century, and the Sanhedrin had not rent its robes at each claim. The blasphemy was the claim to be the Son of Man of Enoch, chapter 62, who would sit on the throne of glory, and whose gaze would produce pain in the kings and the mighty. Jesus was not merely claiming political messiahship. He was claiming to be the figure Enoch had described, whose eyes were the eyes chapter 14 had described. And the high priest recognized the reference. That is why he tore his robes. The Council of Laodicea, meeting in 364 of the Common Era, was aware of this connection. The council's canons do not explicitly reference the Enochic material, but the correspondence of the fathers who prepared the council's canonical decisions does. Athanasius of Alexandria, writing to Serapion of Tmuis in the late 360s, discusses the reasons for the exclusion of Enoch from the canon. His third letter to Serapion, which survives in a Greek manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris under the catalog designation Grec 1284, contains the following passage. Concerning the book called Of Enoch, which some among the brethren still read and cite as if it were of the same authority as the prophets, I have written to thee before, and I write again. There are three matters in this book that cannot be admitted into public reading. The first is the account of the descent of the Watchers, which by its manner of telling implies that the sons of God who took the daughters of men were angelic beings, and not, as some have taught, the descendants of Seth. The second is the description of the imprisonment of these Watchers, in specific places named in the text, for the naming of places gives to the account a character of history rather than allegory, and the people cannot be taught to distinguish. The third is the description of the countenance of the one on the throne in the 14th chapter, which those who hear it will demand to know why the same description appears in the mouths of those who saw the Christ. Athanasius, in his own words, names the reason for the exclusion of the 14th chapter. Not that it is unorthodox, that it is orthodox in a way that reveals too much. Those who hear it will demand to know why the same description appears in the mouths of those who saw the Christ. The description of the eyes, and the demand to know, in Athanasius's phrasing, is a demand for information the church was not prepared to provide. Basil of Caesarea, writing to Gregory of Nazianzus, in a letter preserved in the Basilian Corpus, as Epistle 261, addresses the same question in different terms. Basil writes, We have received from our fathers that the ancient book of Enoch, which some hold to be the source of much of what the Apostle John reveals in his own book of the Apocalypse, is not to be read in the assemblies, for the reason that in it are described things which, if they are true, contain no lie, but nevertheless cannot be spoken to those who have not first been prepared to receive them. Chief among these is the description in the 14th chapter of the appearance of the Ancient of Days upon the throne, which our Lord himself made his own in the transfiguration on the mountain, when the three who were with him saw and could not report what they had seen. Basil connects the description in Enoch 14 to the transfiguration on the mountain. The transfiguration is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew chapter 17 verses 1 through 8, Mark chapter 9 verses 2 through 8, Luke chapter 9 verses 28 through 36. All three accounts describe Jesus taking Peter, James, and John up onto a high mountain, where his face shines as the sun, and his raiment becomes white as the light, and where two figures appear and speak with him, and where a voice from a cloud declares him to be the beloved Son. In all three accounts, the disciples fall on their faces. In Matthew's account, they are afraid greatly. In Mark's account, they know not what to say. In Luke's account, they are silent, and tell no man in those days any of the things which they had seen. Silent. Tell no man. The disciples saw something on the mountain. They fell. They rose. They did not speak of it. Basil, writing 3 centuries later, says that what they saw and could not report was the face Jesus made his own, and that the face was the face described in Enoch chapter 14. The face with the eyes that no created being can withstand. And the disciples, who had lived with Jesus for 2 years, by that point in the gospel narrative, who had walked with him, eaten with him, slept in the same houses as him, saw on the mountain a face that they had not seen before. Not a different face. The same face, in the same body, but with something visible in it that was not usually visible. And what became visible was what Enoch had described. Peter, in the second epistle of Peter chapter 1 verses 16 through 18, refers to the transfiguration as the moment when he and the other disciples were eyewitnesses of his majesty. The Greek word, rendered as majesty, is megaleiotis. It is the same word the Septuagint uses to translate the Hebrew hod in passages describing the glory of God. Peter, in other words, is claiming that what he saw on the mountain was the glory of God visible in the face of Jesus. The face was ordinary until it was not, and when it was not, the disciples fell. The pattern repeats. Enoch on the throne room floor, John at the feet of the risen Christ on Patmos, Longinus at the foot of the cross at Golgotha, Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration, Paul on the road to Damascus. 5 separate encounters, 5 separate falls, and in every case, the fall is triggered by the eyes. Now, one further layer must be introduced before we can approach the Byzantine icon tradition and the imperial correspondence of the year 692. The layer is what the Enochic material says about how the eyes function. Not merely what they look like, but what they do. Chapter 49 of the Book of Enoch describes the Son of Man in terms of the Spirit that rests upon him. Verse 3. And in him dwells the Spirit of wisdom, and the Spirit which gives insight, and the Spirit of understanding and of might, and the Spirit of those who have fallen asleep in righteousness. And he shall judge the secret things, and none shall be able to utter a lying word before him, for he is the elect one before the Lord of spirits according to his good pleasure. The verse describes a specific attribute of the Son of Man. He shall judge the secret things. And in the following clause, the mechanism. None shall be able to utter a lying word before him. The presence of the Son of Man renders lying impossible, not by deterrence, by some quality inherent to his presence that produces truth in those who stand before him. The mechanism is not explained further in chapter 49, but chapter 62, in describing the moment of the arrival of the Son of Man, elaborates. Verse 3, And there shall stand up in that day all the kings and the mighty, and the exalted, and those who hold the earth, and they shall see and recognize how he sits on the throne of his glory. Verse 4, And righteousness is judged before him, and no lying word is spoken before him. The seeing is the recognition is the judgment, and the judgment is executed not by decree but by the incapacity of the observers to speak falsely in his presence. The eyes are the mechanism. The eyes see through, not around, but through. Whatever is inside the observer is seen, and whatever is seen is exposed. This is the description of a faculty that Enoch attributes to the Son of Man, and that the Gospels attribute to Jesus of Nazareth in a series of specific incidents. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 42. Jesus meets Simon Peter for the first time. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation, a stone. Jesus looks at Simon, he beholds him, and in beholding him, he names him according to what Simon will become. He does not ask, he does not deduce, he sees. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 47 and 48. Jesus meets Nathanael. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and saith of him, Behold an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile. Nathanael saith unto him, Whence knowest thou me? Jesus answered and said unto him, Before that Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee. The verb is again the verb of seeing. Jesus saw Nathanael under the fig tree before Nathanael had entered his physical field of vision. The seeing was a seeing that operated outside the normal constraints of physical proximity. And when the seeing is applied to Nathanael, Nathanael responds by immediately declaring Jesus to be the Son of God and the King of Israel. He does not require further evidence. The seeing itself is the evidence. The Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 17 through 19, Jesus at the well in Samaria. The Samaritan woman says she has no husband. Jesus responds, Thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that saidst thou truly. The woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. The pattern is the same. The seeing precedes any information Jesus could have obtained by ordinary means. The seeing produces the recognition. The recognition produces the confession. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, verse 4. Jesus, perceiving their thoughts, said, "Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts?" The Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 8. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man which had the withered hand, "Rise up, and stand forth in the midst." And he arose and stood forth. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 61. And the Lord turned, and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, "Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. The Lord turned and looked upon Peter. This is the passage that closes the identification. Peter, at the moment of his denial in the courtyard of the high priest, is seen by Jesus. Jesus is inside, being interrogated. Peter is outside, warming himself at a fire. And Jesus turns and looks. The turning is deliberate, the looking is directed, and the effect on Peter is immediate. He remembers. He goes out. He weeps. The eyes did not merely see Peter. They reminded Peter of what Peter had forgotten. They reached into Peter's memory and pulled forward the word of the Lord. And the reaching triggered the collapse. This is the mechanism Enoch described in chapter 49. None shall be able to utter a lying word before him. Peter had just uttered 3 lying words, 3 denials, and when the Lord turned and looked upon him, the lie collapsed, and Peter with it. The eyes are not simply bright. They are not simply intense. They are cognitive. They see the interior of the observer. And the observer, seeing that his interior is seen, cannot maintain the composure that ordinary life requires. He falls. He weeps. He is discharged from the legion and departs for Cappadocia. He rises from the throne room floor with his whole body trembling. He falls on Patmos as if dead. The pattern is not variable. It is uniform across the entire body of testimony. The Byzantine icon tradition preserves what the Western Church, after the split of 1054, largely lost. The tradition preserves a specific set of canonical instructions for the depiction of Christ, and those instructions include a specific instruction concerning the eyes. The instruction is not preserved in the Western Catholic tradition. It is not preserved in the Protestant traditions that emerged from the Reformation. It is preserved only in the Eastern churches, and within those churches, it is preserved most fully in the Greek Orthodox tradition, which traces its canonical iconography to a specific document produced by the Quinisext Council of 692. The Quinisext Council, also called the Council in Trullo, met in the domed hall of the Imperial Palace in Constantinople in the year 692, under the presidency of the Emperor Justinian II. Its canons were not accepted by the Roman Church of the West, which is one reason its decisions have received less scholarly attention in the Western literature than their significance warrants. But for the Eastern churches, the Council in Trullo produced the foundational canonical instructions for the depiction of Christ in visual art. Canon 82 of the Council reads, in the standard Greek text, preserved in the Ralls and Pottles collection of the canons of the Orthodox Church. We decree, therefore, that henceforth, in the images which are being drawn, the image of the incarnation of Christ our God be shown as it is according to the human form which he assumed, and not according to the ancient symbols, so that we may consider the sublime nature of the humility of God, the Word, and be led to remember his life in the flesh, and his passion, and his saving death, and the redemption thence accruing to the world. Canon 82 prohibits the use of the ancient lamb symbol for Christ, and requires the depiction of the human form. It is the canon that established the requirement that Christ be shown as a man in the visual tradition. The canon's stated purpose is to preserve the memory of the incarnation. Canon 82 is the public canon. It appears in the standard collections. But the imperial correspondence surrounding the council includes an additional document that does not appear in the standard canonical collections and that survives only in a single manuscript in the imperial library that was later transferred to the Escorial in Spain during the reign of Philip I. The manuscript is catalogued in the Escorial as Codex Escorialensis Y-2-3. The manuscript contains a letter from the Emperor Justinian II to the leading icon painter of Constantinople at the time of the Quinisext Council, a monk named Lazarus of Chalcedon. The letter was written approximately 6 months after the council concluded, in the winter of 692 to 693. It is a supplementary instruction to Canon 82, addressing questions the council had left unaddressed. It is written in the imperial Greek chancery style of the late 7th century, and its authenticity has been accepted by the two major Western scholars who have examined it: the German paleographer Franz Dolger, working in the 1930s, and the French Byzantinist André Grabar, working in the 1960s. Neither of them published a full study of the letter's content. Both of them noted its significance and moved on to other projects. The letter, in the section that concerns the eyes, reads as follows. I will read the Greek and then translate. Peride ton ophthalmon tu Kyriou, hen so e pain bulumai. Hozographos hos empoieten eikona tu Christou, de tuto propanton edenai, hoti hoi ophthalmoioto uk esi hos hoi ophthalmoi hemon, kai tuto uk esti mysterion apoke crimenon, ala ho eperota he ecclesia. Ephainanto hoi apostoloi kai hoi martyris to, entais graphe logo, hoti hoi ophthalmoioto hos flox pyros. Cre aunton zographon graphen ten eikona hoste hohoron oten, epistrepsethai esioton, kai me dynastai, stenai kata prosopon, e me tuto poie, u graphe ton Christon. Translation. Concerning the eyes of the Lord, one thing I wish to say to you. The painter who makes the image of Christ must know this before all else, that his eyes are not as our eyes. And this is not a hidden mystery, but that which the church herself inquires into. The apostles and the martyrs bore witness in the word of the scriptures, that his eyes are as a flame of fire. It is therefore necessary for the painter to write the icon in such a way that the one who looks upon it is turned back into himself and cannot stand face to face. If he does not do this, he does not paint the Christ. The letter is a technical instruction to the painter concerning a specific aspect of the image. The imperial chancery is instructing Lazarus of Chalcedon that the eyes of Christ, as depicted in the icon, must produce a specific effect in the viewer. The viewer must be turned back into himself. The viewer must not be able to stand face to face. If the icon does not produce this effect, the icon has failed to depict Christ. This is the source of the Byzantine convention that Christ in icons is depicted with eyes that are asymmetrical, that appear to be looking at the viewer regardless of the viewer's position, and that resist direct sustained gaze. The convention is not artistic, it is doctrinal. It derives from the imperial instruction of 692, which is itself derived from Enoch chapter 14 and Revelation chapter 1, and which is preserved in the letter Justinian II wrote to Lazarus of Chalcedon. The letter concludes with a specific reference. Justinian writes, Kai tuto euresis anto biblo tu Enoch, ho en palai entais ecclesiais anaginoskomenon, ala nin uketi anaginoskatai. And this thou shalt find in the Book of Enoch, which formerly was read in the churches, but now is no longer read. The emperor cites Enoch by name. He says the book was formerly read in the churches, past tense. He says it is no longer read, present tense of the 7th century. He is describing the state of the book 3 centuries after the Council of Laodicea removed it. The book had been suppressed in the West. In the East, it continued to be read in some churches into the 4th and 5th centuries. By the 7th century, the emperor writing to a Constantinopolitan painter can refer to it as no longer read. But he can still cite it. He can still expect a monk in Chalcedon to know the passage he is referencing. The suppression was recent enough that literate ecclesiastical circles still knew what the book said. And what the book said was the description of the eyes. The description that had governed the depiction of Christ in the earliest Christian art before the standardization efforts of the 5th and 6th centuries. The description that Justinian was formalizing into imperial canon in 692, the description that the Byzantine icon tradition, from that point forward, would preserve in its visual language for the next 13 centuries. Every Byzantine icon of Christ Pantocrator, from the earliest surviving example at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, dated to the 6th century, to the mosaics of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, to the icons of the Cretan school, to the icons produced in Russia after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, follows the same convention concerning the eyes. The eyes do not match. One eye is stern, one eye is merciful. The gaze cannot be met by any single viewpoint. The viewer, moving in front of the icon, finds that the eyes follow. The viewer, standing still, finds that the gaze intensifies. The viewer, attempting to look directly into the eyes for an extended period, finds that the effort produces a specific interior effect. The effect is not comfortable. It was not meant to be. The effect the Byzantine icon produces is a rendering, in paint and gold leaf, of the effect Enoch described in the throne room, the effect Longinus described at the foot of the cross, the effect Peter, James, and John experienced on the mountain, the effect that in every case produces the collapse of the observer. The icon is designed to produce the collapse in miniature. a rehearsal of the confrontation with the eyes as fire, and the imperial correspondence of 692 confirms that this was the design intent. The Codex Escuriolensis, Y2-3, has been in the collection of the Escorial since 1584. It has been accessible to scholars. It has been cited in specialist literature. It has not been widely circulated in translation. The letter of Justinian II to Lazarus of Chalcedon has never been included in any standard collection of Byzantine imperial correspondence. There is no ideological reason for the omission. There is only the pattern that runs through all of this material. The passages that describe the eyes are the passages that do not travel. They stay where they are. They exist. They are catalogued. They are studied by a small number of specialists, and they are not read alongside the other material to which they belong. Now, one further Byzantine document must be introduced. It is a text called the Chronography of Theophanes the Confessor, produced in the early 9th century. Theophanes was a monk of the monastery of the Great Field, and his chronography is one of the principal Greek historical sources for the 7th and 8th centuries. In the section covering the year 706, Theophanes records an incident that took place in Constantinople after the return of Justinian II to the throne following his exile in Cherson. Justinian II had been overthrown in 695, exiled, and lived for 10 years in Cherson on the northern shore of the Black Sea. He returned to Constantinople in 705 and reclaimed the throne. His return was marked by a series of imperial actions that Theophanes describes as characterized by an intense religious focus. In the following year, 706, Justinian ordered a new icon of Christ Pantocrator to be produced for the imperial palace. The commission was given to Lazarus of Chalcedon, the same painter to whom Justinian had written the letter of 692 concerning the eyes. Lazarus produced the icon. The icon was installed in the imperial palace in the autumn of 706, and Theophanes records what happened next. I will translate directly. In that year, the emperor commanded the monk Lazarus of Chalcedon to make an icon of the Lord Christ Pantocrator for the imperial hall. The icon was made and set upon the wall, and the emperor came to see it. And when he stood before the icon, he wept and could not raise his eyes. And after he had wept for some time, he ordered that a veil be drawn across the face of the icon, so that only in the hours of the imperial prayer might the face be uncovered. And the veil was drawn, and it remained drawn until the fall of the emperor. Justinian II, who had commissioned the icon, who had specified the doctrine for its eyes, who had ordered a painter to produce it, could not stand before his own commissioned icon. He wept. He could not raise his eyes. He ordered a veil, the pattern from Enoch chapter 14. Enoch bowed his face downwards, the pattern from Revelation chapter 1 verse 17. John fell at his feet as dead, the pattern from the Longinus deposition, et carui in terram tanquam mortuus, the pattern from the Gospel of Luke chapter 22 verse 61. Peter went out and wept bitterly. The pattern from the chronography of Theophanes. The emperor wept and could not raise his eyes. The eyes, always the eyes. And the response, in every case, is the same. Justinian II fell from power 4 years later. He was executed in 711. The icon Lazarus of Chalcedon had produced was destroyed during the iconoclast controversy of the 8th century, along with most of the imperial icon collection. The veil that had covered its face for 4 years was not enough to preserve it through the theological convulsions that followed. But the imperial correspondence remained. The Escorial manuscript remained. And the chronography of Theophanes remained. 3 documents, all Byzantine, all from a century in which the Book of Enoch was, in the emperor's own words, no longer read, and all describing an icon whose eyes were designed according to the specifications of a book that officially no longer belonged to the canon. The canon had rejected the book. The doctrine of the book remained embedded in the visual tradition of the church that had rejected it. This is the pattern the Western Church has, until relatively recently, been unable to see. The Western Church rejected Enoch at the Council of Laodicea, kept the rejection in force through the medieval period, and inherited from the Reformation a Bible that did not include Enoch and a set of theological categories that did not require Enoch for their coherence. But the visual tradition of Christianity, which entered the West from the East through the Byzantine iconographic influence on early medieval and Romanesque art, carried with it the doctrine of the eyes. Every medieval Pantocrator in a Western cathedral apse, every Christ in majesty in a manuscript illumination, every Ottonian ivory carving of the risen Christ, follows the same convention concerning the eyes as the Byzantine originals from which those forms derive. The doctrine survived in paint even after it had been removed from text. And when scholars finally began to reconstruct the manuscript history of the Book of Enoch in the 19th century, following James Bruce's return from Ethiopia in 1773 with 3 complete Ge'ez copies, the first thing that became apparent to the readers who worked through the Ge'ez text was that they had already seen this material. They had seen it in the icons. They had seen it in Revelation. They had seen it in the transfiguration accounts of the Gospels. They had not read it in Enoch, because they had not read Enoch, but they had read what Enoch had produced. Richard Lawrence, an Anglican priest and later Archbishop of Cashel, produced the first English translation of the Book of Enoch in 1821. His preface addresses the shock of recognition that reading the text produced in him. He writes, "I have been for many years engaged in the reading of the Fathers of the Church and of the earliest Christian writers on the subject of the last things, and I have thought myself familiar with the imagery employed by those writers to describe the coming of the Son of Man and the judgment of the last day. On reading the Book of Enoch for the first time, I found that the imagery I had believed to be of Christian origin was not of Christian origin, but was of an earlier origin, and that the Christian writers had drawn from this book what I had believed to be their own composition. This was a matter of considerable astonishment to me, and I was sometime in reconciling myself to the implications." Lawrence's astonishment was not idiosyncratic. It has been the experience of every serious Western reader of the Book of Enoch since 1773. The book contains, in a form that predates the New Testament by centuries, the imagery the New Testament uses to describe the Son of Man. The imagery was not developed by the New Testament writers. It was inherited from a text the Church subsequently rejected, and the imagery includes, specifically, the description of the eyes. Before we move on to the next passage of testimony, stop for a second. What you just heard about the Byzantine icon tradition and the letter of Justinian II is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ge'ez passage, the Codex Escurialensis reference, the Theophanies account. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The fragment recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran and cataloged in the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book collection under the designation 4Q205 is a small piece of leather, approximately 11 centimeters by 7 centimeters. It preserves 22 words of Aramaic text, from what is now identified as chapter 14 of the Book of Enoch, verse 21, the verse describing the impossibility of any created being looking upon the face of the one on the throne. It is the only surviving Aramaic witness to that specific verse. Every other manuscript of the verse is in Ge'ez, or in the Greek intermediate that the Ge'ez translated from. The fragment was recovered in 1952 by a team led by the French Dominican archaeologist Roland Deveau, who directed the excavations at Qumran under the auspices of the École biblique et archéologique française in Jerusalem. The fragment was assigned to Joseph Milik for publication. Milik, a Polish Dominican and one of the principal editors of the Qumran corpus, worked on the Aramaic Enoch fragments for the next 24 years. He published his edition in 1976 under the title The Books of Enoch, Aramaic Fragments of Qumran Cave 4. Milik's edition included the fragment 4Q205 in a general listing but did not include a photograph. His transcription of the 22 words differs in 3 specific places from what a subsequent examination of the fragment by the American scholar James Vanderkam in 1984 recorded. Vanderkam noted the discrepancies in a footnote to his own edition and requested access to the fragment for direct examination. His request was granted for the purposes of that specific verification. Since Vanderkam's examination in 1984, no additional scholar has been permitted to directly examine the fragment. Photographic reproductions were prohibited by the Israel Antiquities Authority in 1974 following a review of the entire corpus that classified certain fragments as requiring restricted access. Fragment 4Q205 was among those classified. The reason given at the time of the classification, in a memorandum issued by the acting director of the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, was that the fragment had suffered flaking during handling and required consolidation before further photography could be undertaken. The consolidation was reported as completed in 1979. The photography did not resume. Requests filed in 1988, 1996, and 2011 by 3 separate scholars for permission to photograph the fragment have been declined. What Milik and Vanderkam agreed the fragment contains, in the 22 Aramaic words that survive, is a version of chapter 14 verse 21 that differs from the Ge'ez text in one specific respect. Where the Jez says that no flesh was able to look upon him, the Aramaic uses a phrase that both Millick and Vanderkam rendered as, and no eye of flesh was able to bear the fire of his eyes. The Aramaic makes explicit what the Jez leaves implicit. The fire is in the eyes. The bearing that is impossible is the bearing of the fire that comes from those eyes. The Jez preserves the categorical statement. The Aramaic preserves the mechanism. And the mechanism is precisely the mechanism described in the Latin of the Longinus deposition, oculi qui non feri possunt, sicut ignis, eyes that cannot be born, like fire. The Aramaic phrase, in its full form, includes a compound the two scholars rendered slightly differently. Millick's rendering, Gehal Enohi, fire of his eyes. Vanderkam's rendering, Gehal Enohi, the same phrase, with a slight difference in the vocalization of the possessive suffix. Both scholars agree on the substance. The Aramaic makes the fire an attribute specifically of the eyes. This is significant for the reconstruction of the transmission history. The Jez translation, produced from a Greek intermediate in the 4th or 5th century, softened the explicit reference to the eyes as the source of the fire. It preserved the impossibility of looking, but it distributed the source of the impossibility more generally to the majesty and glory of the figure on the throne. The Aramaic, which is older than the Jez by at least 5 centuries and probably closer to 7, preserves what the Jez muted. The fire is in the eyes. The impossibility is the impossibility of receiving that fire on the eye of the observer. And the Aramaic reading is confirmed by an additional Greek fragment. The Greek fragment is one of the pieces of what scholars call the Chester Beatty Papyri, an early Christian manuscript collection now housed in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. Papyrus number 12 in the collection is a fragmentary Greek text of portions of the Book of Enoch, dated to the 4th century of the Common Era, produced somewhere in Egypt and acquired by the American mining magnate Alfred Chester Beatty in the 1930s through the antiquities market in Cairo. The papyrus is important because it preserves the Greek intermediate that the Jez translated from, in a witness that predates the Jez by at least a century. Papyrus 12 preserves the Greek of chapter 14, verse 21. The relevant Greek phrase, in the Standard Critical Edition, reads, Kai udeis anthropon edinato idein tu prosoponato, hoti hoi ophthalmoi auto, hos flox pyros esan, kai udeis on sarki dynatai, bastasai tu pir, tu ekton ophthalmon auto pro erkomenon. Translation. And no man was able to look upon his face, because his eyes were as a flame of fire, and no one in flesh is able to bear the fire proceeding from his eyes. The Greek confirms the Aramaic. The fire proceeds from the eyes. And the Greek uses the phrase hoi ophthalmoi autu hos flox pyros, his eyes as a flame of fire. The exact phrase, word for word, letter for letter, that appears in the Book of Revelation chapter 1, verse 14. Hoi ophthalmoi autu hos flox pyros. The Greek of Papyrus 12, from a 4th century Egyptian manuscript of the Book of Enoch, and the Greek of Revelation chapter 1, from a 1st century apocalyptic vision attributed to John of Patmos, contain the identical phrase, not a paraphrase, not a variant, the identical Greek phrase, in the identical order, with the identical grammar. The mainstream scholarly response to this identity has been to argue that John of Patmos and the Greek translator of Enoch were both drawing on a common apocalyptic tradition that had rendered the imagery of the throne room into standard Greek liturgical formulas by the 1st century of the Common Era, and that the phrase reflects that shared formulaic vocabulary rather than direct dependence in either direction. That response is possible in principle. It is difficult in practice, because the phrase does not appear in any other Greek text of the period, not in the Septuagint, not in the writings of Philo, not in the Greek fragments of any other apocalyptic work. It appears in Enoch, it appears in Revelation. It appears nowhere else. And the Aramaic of 4Q205, which predates any Greek translation of the phrase by at least 2 centuries, contains the same content in Aramaic. Fire from the eyes, the bearing impossibility. The transmission chain runs. Aramaic Enoch, 3rd century before the Common Era. Greek Enoch, 1st century before the Common Era. Revelation, 1st century of the Common Era. Jez Enoch, 5th century of the Common Era. Every link in the chain preserves the description of the eyes. The Jez softens the mechanism, but preserves the categorical statement. The Aramaic and Greek preserve the mechanism explicitly. And Revelation quotes the Greek verbatim. This is the philological foundation on which the entire subsequent tradition rests. When Athanasius wrote to Serapion in the 360s and said that those who hear the 14th chapter of Enoch will demand to know why the same description appears in the mouths of those who saw the Christ, he was referring to this exact identity. The Greek was the same in both texts. Anyone who read both would see it, and once they had seen it, they would ask. The Council of Laodicea suppressed one of the two texts, the one they could suppress, the one that had not yet become canonical scripture. The Book of Revelation was canonical by 364. It could not be excluded. It had been read in the churches for 3 centuries. It was cited by the church fathers as authoritative. It could not be removed. Enoch was in a different position. It had been read in the churches. It had been cited by Jude, by Barnabas, by Tertullian, by Clement of Alexandria, by Origen. Origen, in his commentary on the Gospel of John and in his treatise against Celsus, cites Enoch as scripture and quotes chapter 14. But by the 4th century, the position of Enoch in the canon was contested. Athanasius, in his festal letter of 367, produced the first surviving list of canonical books that excludes Enoch. His exclusion was subsequently ratified at Laodicea. The book was suppressed. The parallel with Revelation was thereby broken. The Greek phrase in Enoch was hidden from ordinary Christian readers. The Greek phrase in Revelation remained, and the reader of Revelation, without access to the Greek of Enoch, would experience the phrase in Revelation as unique to that book. For 17 centuries, that was the reading condition of Western Christianity. Until James Bruce brought the Ge'ez back from Ethiopia in 1773, until Richard Lawrence translated it in 1821, until the Qumran fragments were recovered in 1952, until Joseph Millick published the Aramaic in 1976, until the identity of the Greek phrase became visible again, at which point the entire question of the description of the eyes had to be reopened, and the mainstream response was to acknowledge the parallel while attributing it to shared tradition rather than direct dependence. The direct dependence question remains open. The description of the eyes, whatever its transmission history, is preserved in 4 independent lines of evidence. Aramaic Enoch, Greek Enoch, Ge'ez Enoch, Greek Revelation, 4 witnesses to the same imagery, 2 of them ancient, 2 of them slightly less ancient, all of them describing the same being, the same eyes, and the same effect on the observer. And beneath that manuscript record, there is one further layer that must be addressed. The layer is Egypt, because the description of the eyes as fire that reaches and consumes the observer is not confined to the Jewish and Christian traditions. It appears in a specific form in the funerary literature of ancient Egypt, and the Egyptian material is older than Enoch. The pyramid texts, the oldest surviving religious literature of ancient Egypt, were carved into the interior walls of the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties at Saqqara, beginning approximately with the Pyramid of Unas around 2350 before the Common Era. They are the oldest known religious writings in human history that address the fate of the soul after death, and they are the oldest known texts that describe the appearance of the divine. Spell 213 of the pyramid texts, which appears on the north wall of the sarcophagus chamber of the Pyramid of Unas, contains a description of the sun god Ra as he appears at the horizon of the eastern sky. The description includes a specific reference to the eyes of Ra. The relevant passage, in the standard translation by the American Egyptologist Raymond O. Faulkner, published in 1969, reads, "Ra rises from the horizon of the east. His eyes are 2 flames. No god can stand before them. No man can bear them." The Egyptian phrase, transliterated from the hieroglyphic, is JRTY equals FMNSWTSNTJ, NJNNTR, HTRIM HR equals SN, NJNSRMTF3J equals SN. His 2 eyes are 2 flames. No god stands before them. No man of the people can bear them. 2,350 years before the Common Era. The description of the eyes of the divine as flames that no god and no man can bear. The Egyptian text predates the Book of Enoch by 2,000 years at least. The Egyptian text is not in any tradition that could have influenced the composition of Enoch. The Egyptian text is not in any language that Enoch's compositional community would have had access to. And yet the Egyptian text preserves the same description. The Egyptian material continues in the coffin texts, the successor tradition to the pyramid texts, which developed in the Middle Kingdom period, approximately 2050 to 1650 before the Common Era. Coffin text, spell 78. From a coffin recovered from a shaft tomb at Deir el-Bersha and now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo under catalog number CG 28083, contains a description of the appearance of the god Osiris in judgment. The description includes the same imagery of the eyes as flames. The Egyptian phrase in this text uses a compound that Faulkner translated as the eyes that consume from within, and that the German Egyptologist Erich Hornung, in his 1997 monograph on the funerary literature, rendered as eyes whose fire enters the beholder. Eyes whose fire enters the beholder. Enoch chapter 14. In the Aramaic reading, the fire of his eyes that no eye of flesh can bear. Revelation chapter 1 verse 14. His eyes were as a flame of fire. Coffin text spells 78 in Hornung's rendering. Eyes whose fire enters the beholder. 3 separate texts, 3 separate languages, 3 separate religious traditions, all describing the same phenomenon. And the Egyptian material continues into the New Kingdom. The Book of Gates, the funerary text of the 18th and 19th dynasties, includes in its 9th division a description of the 12 serpents who guard the fire of the sun god's eyes. The description is preserved in the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings. On the walls of the sarcophagus chamber, in hieroglyphic text that has been read continuously since the tomb's discovery by Giovanni Battista Belzoni in 1817. The relevant passage reads, "These serpents guard the fire that goes forth from the eyes of Ra, the fire that no man may look upon, the fire that consumes the foreheads of those who approach." The fire that consumes the foreheads of those who approach. The consumption of the forehead is a specific detail. It appears in the Book of Gates. It does not appear in the pyramid texts or the coffin texts. It represents a development in the Egyptian tradition, and it corresponds, in a specific way, to a detail in the Book of Enoch that has received relatively little scholarly attention. Chapter 14 of the Book of Enoch, verse 23, in the Ge'ez text, describes the moment after Enoch has entered the presence of the throne. The verse reads, "And no angel could enter this house, or behold it by reason of its splendor and glory, and no flesh could behold it. The fire was burning around about him, and a great fire stood before him." But the following verse, 24, in the Ge'ez, contains a phrase that Robert Henry Charles softened in his 1912 translation, and that Ephraim Isaac restored in 1983. Isaac's rendering, "And I looked, and I saw within it a lofty throne, and its appearance was as crystal, and its wheels were as the shining sun. And I saw the watchers of the cherubim." The watchers of the cherubim. The phrase in the Ge'ez is Meshelet Zacherubel. It literally means the watching ones of the cherubim, or, in a slightly different vocalization, those who watch through the cherubim. The phrase is unique in the Ge'ez apocalyptic corpus. It appears here and nowhere else. And what it appears to describe, on Isaac's reading and on the reading of the Ethiopian priest Abba Gorgorios of Aksum, who assisted James Bruce with the initial translation in 1773, is a category of being whose function is to observe from the throne outward. The cherubim bear the throne. The watchers watch through them. The Egyptian material about the serpents guarding the fire of Ra's eyes is functionally parallel. The serpents are the mediators between the fire of the eyes and the beings who approach the fire. They regulate the emission. They channel the fire toward those who are to be judged and away from those who are not. The Book of Gates makes this explicit in the following divisions. The serpents open their coils to those who approach in righteousness, and they close their coils against those who approach in unrighteousness. The eyes of Ra, mediated by the serpents. The eyes of the one on the throne in Enoch, mediated by the watchers of the cherubim. The parallel is precise, and the parallel raises a question that Egyptological and Enochic scholarship have never systematically addressed together. The question is whether the Enochic material draws on Egyptian sources, whether the Egyptian material draws on a common ancient Near Eastern source that also produced Enoch, or whether both traditions are describing the same phenomenon from different vantage points. The two disciplines have not spoken to each other because they belong to different departments in the modern university. Egyptology is one department, biblical studies is another, Second Temple Judaism is another. The scholars who work on the pyramid texts are not the scholars who work on Qumran, and the scholars who work on Qumran are not the scholars who work on Byzantine iconography. Each tradition is deep in its own material. But the connections between the traditions are visible only to a reader who moves across the departmental boundaries, and the description of the eyes is one of those connections. There are 4 independent lines of evidence: Egyptian, in the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and Book of Gates; Jewish, in the Aramaic and Ge'ez of Enoch; Christian, in the Greek of Revelation and the Latin of the Longinus deposition; Byzantine, in the Greek of the Justinian correspondence and the Greek of the chronography of Theophanes. 4 traditions, 4 separate compositional communities, 4 separate languages of primary composition, and the same description of the eyes of the divine as a fire that reaches out from the eyes and consumes the observer. The Egyptian material, being the oldest, complicates the simplest explanation of the pattern. It cannot be reduced to the influence of Enoch, because it predates Enoch by 2 millennia. It cannot be reduced to the influence of the New Testament, because it predates the New Testament by 2.5 millennia. It appears in the pyramid texts of the pharaoh Unas at the very dawn of surviving human religious literature, and it describes the same phenomenon that Longinus described at the foot of the cross and that Justinian II wept before in the imperial hall of Constantinople. The phenomenon is stable across 3,000 years of independent religious traditions. Whatever the phenomenon is, it is not confined to one culture, one tradition, or one revelatory moment. It appears wherever the divine appears. The Babylonian material introduces a 4th vector, and the Babylonian material is the vector that most directly implicates the claim that the description of the eyes is not merely religious imagery but the description of an observable phenomenon. The Neo-Assyrian relief, now housed in the British Museum under the accession number BM 124820, was excavated from the North Palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh by the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard between 1849 and 1851. The relief depicts a scene of divine appearance. The god Ashur, in the standard interpretation of the scene, stands in the presence of a group of human figures who are represented in postures of prostration. 2 of the figures are shown falling backward. 1 figure has raised its arm to shield its face. 3 figures are shown lying flat on the ground. The god himself is depicted in a specific way that is unusual in Neo-Assyrian palace relief. The eyes of the god are inlaid. The rest of the figure is carved in the standard low-relief technique of the palace reliefs in Mosul marble, with the details of clothing, weaponry, and hair rendered in incised line. But the eyes are not carved. They are inlaid with a material that, on examination by British Museum conservators in 1975, was identified as a paste of ground lapis lazuli combined with a small percentage of gold leaf and applied to a specifically prepared substrate. The eyes, when the relief was originally installed in the North Palace, would have caught torchlight in a way that the surrounding marble would not have caught it. The eyes would have gleamed. The technique is not unique in ancient Near Eastern art. Inlaid eyes appear in Sumerian statuary from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The famous statuettes from the Square Temple at Tel Asmar, now in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, have inlaid eyes of shell and lapis. The technique represents a specific religious convention. The eyes of the divine were understood to be qualitatively different from the eyes of the human. They were understood to emit rather than merely receive light. And the inlaid materials were selected specifically because they would produce, under the conditions of temple illumination by lamp and torch, an effect that would approximate that emission. BM 124820 is unusual because it appears in a palace context rather than a temple context, and because it explicitly depicts the effect of the emission on the human observers. The human figures in the relief are shown at the precise moment of their reaction to the eyes. 2 are falling, 1 is shielding, 3 are prone, and the god above them, with his inlaid eyes, is shown as the source of the reaction. The cuneiform inscription accompanying the relief has been published by the German Assyriologist Reichel Borger in his 1996 edition of the Inscriptions of Ashurbanipal. The inscription reads, "In Borger's translation, when Ashur made his face manifest in the throne room, the enemies of the king fell before him. They lay in the dust. They could not raise their heads. Their eyes could not bear the fire that came forth from his eyes. And I, Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria, stood before him and did not fall, because he had chosen me and set his hand upon my shoulder." The inscription is not vague. The enemies of the king fell. Their eyes could not bear the fire that came forth from his eyes. The imagery is the imagery of Enoch. It is the imagery of the pyramid texts. It is the imagery of Revelation, and it is inscribed in cuneiform on a stone relief that was carved during the reign of Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 631 before the Common Era. Ashurbanipal is contemporary with the traditional dating of the composition of the Book of the Watchers, in one of the higher datings that some scholars have proposed. He is a century or 2 earlier than the more common scholarly consensus dating. In either case, the Assyrian material is either contemporary with or slightly earlier than the earliest Enochic material. And the Assyrian material contains, in cuneiform, the same description. The transmission channels among these traditions are not clear. There is no established scholarly framework that traces a line from the pyramid texts of Unas at Saqqara in 2350 before the Common Era, through the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, through the New Kingdom Book of Gates, through the Neo-Assyrian palace inscriptions of Ashurbanipal, through the Aramaic Enoch of the 3rd century before the Common Era, through the Ge'ez translation of the 4th to 5th century of the Common Era, into the Greek of Revelation, and into the Byzantine icon tradition. No single scholar has traced that line, because the traces cross too many disciplinary boundaries. But the line is visible, and the line, followed backward, points to something. It points to a common substrate. The common substrate is a description that appears independently in every culture that produced a written record of an encounter with what those cultures called the divine. The description varies in linguistic register and in specific vocabulary. It is stable in structure. The eyes are fire. The fire reaches from the eyes. The observer cannot bear the fire. The observer falls. The fall is not metaphor. It is the physical response to the reception of the fire. This is what the Book of Enoch preserved when it described the throne room. This is what the Egyptian priests preserved when they carved the pyramid texts. This is what the Assyrian scribes preserved when they composed the palace inscriptions of Ashurbanipal. This is what the Roman soldier Longinus recorded when he stood at the foot of the cross. This is what the Apostle John recorded when he wrote the Book of Revelation on Patmos. And this is what the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II insisted his icon painter reproduce in the visual language of Byzantine iconography. The pattern is uniform across 3,000 years, and the pattern is what the Church, meeting at Laodicea in 364, decided the ordinary Christian could not be permitted to know. The reason for the decision is inferable from the correspondence of the fathers who prepared it. Athanasius, in the letter to Serapion, is explicit. Those who hear it will demand to know why the same description appears in the mouths of those who saw the Christ. The demand for the knowledge is what the exclusion was designed to prevent, because the demand, if pursued, would lead the questioner into the wider corpus of parallel materials. It would lead into Egypt. It would lead into Assyria. It would lead into the Egyptian priesthoods and the Babylonian temples. It would lead into questions about the identity of the being described. It would raise the possibility that the being described in the Christian scriptures had been described before by peoples the Church was in the process of converting away from their traditional descriptions. The parallel with Egyptian and Assyrian material was not, in the framework of 4th century Christian orthodoxy, evidence that the Christian revelation was continuous with older traditions of divine encounter. It was a threat to the uniqueness claim on which the missionary project depended. If the fire in the eyes of Christ was the fire in the eyes of Ra, if the fall of Longinus before Christ was the fall of the enemies of Ashurbanipal before Ashur, then the claim of Christianity to have received a unique revelation was compromised. The claim could be preserved, in the pastoral judgment of the 4th century Church, only by excluding the material that made the parallels visible. Enoch was the material that made the parallels visible. Enoch was excluded, and the exclusion succeeded, for 17 centuries, in keeping the parallels from being systematically examined. They are being examined now, not by the churches, by the scholars whose work bridges the disciplinary boundaries, by the Egyptologists who read Enoch, by the Assyriologists who read Revelation, by the Byzantine art historians who read the pyramid texts. Slowly, over the past century and a half, the parallels have been reassembled. The description of the eyes has been reconstructed across the 4 traditions. And what has become visible is what Athanasius, in the letter to Serapion, said would become visible if the material were made available. The demand to know why the same description appears everywhere. The demand has been made. It has not, in any comprehensive published form, been answered. Now there is one further vector that must be introduced before the argument can be completed. The vector is Jewish mystical literature, specifically the Hekhalot corpus, a body of texts that developed in Jewish rabbinic circles between the 2nd and 7th centuries of the Common Era, in the shadow of the destruction of the Second Temple and the dispersion of Judaism into the diaspora. The Hekhalot literature describes the ascent of the sage to the throne of God. It preserves what Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic had begun, and it develops the apocalyptic imagery into a technical vocabulary for what its authors called Yerida la Merkava, the descent to the chariot, which was in fact an ascent to the throne but was called descent by convention, because the mystic descended into the divine encounter from the ordinary condition of consciousness. The principal Hekhalot texts are Hekhalot Rabbati, Hekhalot Zutarti, 3rd Enoch, and the Sefer HaRazim. Of these, 3rd Enoch is the most directly connected to the Enochic tradition, because it presents itself as the continuation of the visionary experience Enoch initiated in the earlier Enochic corpus. 3rd, Enoch describes the ascent of the Rabbi Ishmael, a rabbinic sage of the 2nd century of the Common Era, to the throne of God. And 3rd Enoch describes the throne room encounter using imagery that is directly derived from the Book of Enoch chapter 14. 3rd Enoch chapter 1 describes the appearance of the throne. 3rd Enoch chapter 2 describes the appearance of the one on the throne. And 3rd Enoch chapter 2 verses 7 and 8 describe the eyes. The Hebrew of 3rd Enoch chapter 2 verse 7 reads, Vi inav eineha shel esh kalehavot ha milkshet et hapotot alav. And his eyes are eyes of fire like flames that ensnare the one who looks upon him. The verb translated as ensnare is a technical term in Hebrew mystical vocabulary. It refers to a specific action of the eyes that seizes and holds the observer. The observer, once seized, cannot look away. The looking becomes involuntary, and the involuntary looking is what produces the collapse. The description matches the description in Enoch chapter 14. It matches the description in Revelation chapter 1. It matches the description in the Longinus deposition. And it matches, in Hebrew, what the Egyptian Book of Gates described in hieroglyphic 3,000 years earlier. 3rd Enoch is important not because it adds new information, but because it demonstrates the continuity of the tradition within Judaism itself. The Council of Laodicea excluded Enoch from Christian scripture. It did not exclude it from Jewish mystical literature. 3rd Enoch and the wider Hekkelot corpus continued to develop the imagery of the throne room and the eyes of the one on the throne for the next 3 centuries. And it did so in Hebrew, in rabbinic circles, without any Christian influence. The Jewish material provides the internal Jewish testimony to what the Christian material and the Egyptian material and the Assyrian material also testify. The description is stable across traditions. The description is what those who claim to have seen it, in every tradition that has preserved a record of it, say they saw. And this brings us back to the question at the center of this investigation. What did Jesus of Nazareth actually look like? The New Testament describes Jesus in specific ways. The Gospels describe his teaching, his miracles, his interactions, his death, and his resurrection. They do not describe his physical appearance in the systematic way that a modern reader might expect. There is no description of the color of his hair, the shape of his face, the height of his body. The Gospels are, on physical description, sparse to the point of silence. But the Book of Revelation, written by a man who claimed to have known Jesus during his earthly ministry and to have seen him again in a vision after the resurrection, does contain a physical description. And the physical description in Revelation chapter 1 is the description we have been examining. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice is the sound of many waters. If the Revelation description is taken at face value, and if the identification of the Revelation figure with Jesus of Nazareth is accepted, then Jesus, in his risen form, had white hair, eyes of fire, and feet like burnished brass. The description does not correspond to any ordinary human being. It corresponds to the description in Enoch chapter 14 of the one on the throne. Jesus, in Revelation, is described in the imagery of Enoch's Ancient of Days. The mainstream theological explanation for this is that the description is symbolic. The white hair symbolizes eternity. The eyes of fire symbolize discerning judgment. The brass feet symbolize stability. The imagery is not to be taken as physical description. It is to be understood as theological attribute rendered in visual metaphor. That explanation is available. It is the standard treatment in commentaries on Revelation. But the explanation assumes something about the nature of the vision that the text does not explicitly authorize. The text presents the description in the language of physical observation. John writes, "And being turned, I saw." He does not write, "And I saw a vision of the following meaning." He writes, "I saw." And what he saw, he describes. The physical description in Revelation is either what John saw, or it is a coded theological statement. If the former, then the risen Jesus, in the form in which he appeared to John on Patmos, had the eyes described. If the latter, then the description is metaphor. And the Longinus deposition, if it is authentic, and if the Charnier transcription is accurate, forces the question. Because Longinus was not on Patmos. Longinus was at Golgotha. He was not describing the risen Christ. He was describing the crucified Christ, in the hours before death, in the ordinary daylight of a Judean afternoon. And the description Longinus provided is the same description. Eyes that cannot be born, fire that sees. The observer falls. If Longinus is authentic, then the description in Revelation is not confined to the resurrection appearance. It is a description of what Jesus of Nazareth looked like at moments when what Enoch had described became visible in him. Not all the time, not to everyone, but at certain moments, to certain observers, in certain conditions. The Transfiguration on the mountain is the gospel account of one such moment. His face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light, and the disciples, when they saw it, fell on their faces. The moment before Peter's denial in the courtyard of the high priest, the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. The road to Damascus, and suddenly there shone round about him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth, and he heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? The road to Emmaus. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 31. Two disciples walk with the risen Jesus for a considerable distance without recognizing him. They discuss the events of the crucifixion with him. They invite him to stay with them for a meal. And in the moment of the breaking of the bread, their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. The passage is puzzling in the ordinary reading, because it seems to imply that Jesus was somehow rendered invisible to the two disciples until the moment of the breaking of the bread. But if we read the passage in the light of Enoch chapter 14, a different reading becomes available. Their eyes were opened. That is, the mechanism that had prevented them from seeing was disengaged. What they had been unable to see was the identity of the man with them. And what they saw, when the mechanism was disengaged, was the face they had known during his earthly ministry, now visible through whatever ordinary appearance had been overlaying it in the walk from Jerusalem. The reading is speculative, but it makes sense of the passage in a way the ordinary reading does not. And it aligns with what the Longinus deposition, the Jayas of Enoch, the Aramaic of 4Q 205, the Greek of the Chester Beatty Papyrus 12, and the Byzantine icon tradition all consistently describe. The face of Jesus was, at certain moments, the face of the one on the throne. At other moments, it was the face of a man. The face on the throne was the face beneath the face of the man. And what the Transfiguration made visible was the face beneath, temporarily unveiled. The disciples fell on their faces. The eyes, always the eyes. The Shroud of Turin is the linen cloth housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, which bears the front and back image of a man who was subjected to physical trauma consistent with Roman crucifixion. The shroud has been the subject of scientific investigation since it was first photographed in 1898 by Secondo Pia, whose glass plate negative revealed that the shroud image behaves as a photographic negative with light and dark values reversed from what a painted image would produce. The dating and origin of the shroud remain contested. A radiocarbon dating conducted in 1988 placed the linen sample tested at approximately 1260 to 1390 of the Common Era, a medieval date. Subsequent challenges to that dating, including studies of the sample location, of contamination possibilities, and of textile characteristics inconsistent with medieval European weaving, have kept the question open. This account does not attempt to resolve the dating question. It reports what has been observed about one specific feature of the shroud image. The feature is the eyes. The Shroud of Turin image shows the face of a bearded man with long hair falling to the shoulders. The face is bruised. The nose appears broken. The forehead shows what appear to be puncture wounds. And the eyes are closed. The man depicted, if it is a man depicted, is dead. But the eyes, though closed, have been the subject of a specific investigation that has produced results that are, at minimum, unusual. In 1978, a research team called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, commonly abbreviated as STURP, was granted 5 days of direct access to the shroud for a series of scientific tests. STURP was an interdisciplinary group of American scientists, primarily from the American Air Force Academy, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Sandia National Laboratories. Its members included Ray Rogers, John Jackson, Eric Jumper, Kenneth Stevenson, and other researchers. The team conducted spectroscopic, photographic, and microscopic analysis of the shroud image over the course of 5 days in October 1978. One of the analyses conducted by John Jackson and Eric Jumper was a three-dimensional analysis of the image using a device called a VP8 image analyzer. The VP8 was designed for interpreting NASA satellite data. It converts variations in image density into topographical elevation, producing a three-dimensional model from a two-dimensional image. When Jackson and Jumper analyzed the Turin shroud image with the VP8, they discovered that the shroud image contains three-dimensional information that is not present in ordinary photographs or paintings. Ordinary two-dimensional images, when processed through the VP8, produce distorted three-dimensional models with random elevations. The shroud image produced a coherent three-dimensional model of a human body. Jackson and Jumper published their finding in the journal Applied Optics in 1982. Their analysis has been reproduced. The three-dimensional information in the shroud image is present. It is one of the reasons the shroud has resisted straightforward classification as a medieval forgery. No medieval forger, working with any known medieval technique, could have encoded three-dimensional information into a linen cloth in a way that a device invented in the 20th century could then extract. The relevance of this analysis for the present investigation is what it revealed about the eyes. The three-dimensional analysis of the shroud image showed that objects had been placed over the eyes of the figure on the cloth. The objects appear as small, elevated regions over the eye sockets. Jackson and Jumper initially interpreted the objects as coins, in accordance with the Jewish burial custom of placing coins over the eyes of the deceased. Subsequent analysis by other researchers has produced evidence, disputed but not settled, that the objects were lepta of the procurator Pontius Pilate, small copper coins minted during his procuratorship between 26 and 36 of the Common Era. The identification depends on the interpretation of letters and images that are on the shroud at the extreme limit of resolution. The debate over the coin identification has not been resolved. What is not disputed is that the eyes of the figure on the shroud were, at the moment the image was formed, covered by objects. And what is also not disputed is that the shroud image behaves as though the image was produced by some form of energy emission from the body of the figure onto the cloth. Stirp's spectroscopic analysis found no pigments, no dyes, no brush strokes, no directional application of any medium. The image is not painted, it is not printed, it is not scorched by contact heat, because scorching would penetrate the fibers uniformly rather than only affecting the topmost microlayer, and the shroud image affects only the topmost microlayer of each fiber. The image is present without any known medium producing it. Rogers, in a paper published in Thermochimica Acta in 2005, proposed a chemical reaction between amines from the body and impurities in the linen fibers as a possible mechanism. His proposal accounts for some but not all of the image characteristics. Other researchers have proposed radiation-based mechanisms, including a hypothesis advanced by Paolo Di Lazzaro and colleagues at the ENIA Research Center in Italy, published in 2010, that experimented with excimer laser radiation on linen and demonstrated that ultraviolet radiation at specific wavelengths can produce discoloration of linen fibers that shares certain characteristics with the shroud image. The Di Lazzaro results are experimental. They do not prove that the shroud image was produced by ultraviolet radiation from the body. They demonstrate that ultraviolet radiation is one of the few mechanisms known to physics that can produce, on linen, an image with the fiber-level characteristics the shroud exhibits. And what the Di Lazzaro results implied, in the interpretation of the ENIA researchers themselves, was that the image was produced by a burst of radiation from within the body of the figure wrapped in the cloth. A burst of radiation. The Italian researchers were, in the guarded language of their published papers, describing the image as consistent with what would have been produced if the body wrapped in the cloth had, at some moment, emitted a pulse of electromagnetic radiation intense enough to imprint the surface fibers of the linen with a photograph of the body at that moment. If that reading is accepted, and it is not universally accepted, then the shroud image is the record of an event in which a human body emitted radiation. And the eyes, though covered by objects, appear on the shroud image with a specific characteristic that Rogers noted in his own working papers before his death in 2005. Rogers observed that the shroud image intensity, mapped across the face, shows a slight but measurable elevation in intensity at the location of the eyes, compared to the intensity of the image over the surrounding facial tissue. The elevation is present despite the objects that were placed over the eyes. The eyes, in other words, appear on the shroud as slightly brighter than the surrounding face, as though whatever process produced the image was more intense at the location of the eyes. Rogers did not publish this observation in a peer-reviewed paper. He mentioned it in a lecture at Los Alamos in 2004 and in a letter to a colleague that year. His working papers, deposited at the American Center of Shroud Studies in Colorado after his death, contain the observation and a preliminary quantitative analysis. The analysis has not been formally published. The relevance for this investigation is that, if Rogers' observation is accurate, the shroud image preserves a record of a human body in which the eyes were, at the moment of the image formation, more energetically active than the rest of the face. The Book of Enoch, chapter 14, described eyes as fire. The Book of Revelation chapter 1 described eyes as a flame of fire. The Longinus deposition described eyes that cannot be borne, like fire. The Byzantine iconography preserved the doctrine of the eyes, and a linen cloth in a cathedral in Turin, according to a research team from Los Alamos, may preserve, in the differential intensity of the image over the face, physical evidence of eyes that emitted energy. The physical evidence, if the shroud dating is authentically 1st century, is direct evidence of the phenomenon the manuscript tradition described. The dating question is not resolved. The Rogers observation is not published in peer-reviewed literature. The chain of inference is longer than the manuscript evidence alone. But the chain of inference points in the direction that all of the other evidence points, and if the shroud is what tradition claims it to be, then the eyes on the shroud are the eyes Longinus described. Now, the patristic material contains one further body of evidence that must be introduced, because it constitutes the direct testimony of the earliest Christian writers as to what they had heard from those who had seen Jesus. The evidence is a series of physical descriptions of Jesus, preserved in patristic and apocryphal literature. The descriptions are not consistent with each other in every respect, but they are consistent with each other in one respect that has received relatively little attention. The respect is the eyes. The earliest patristic physical description of Jesus is attributed to a document called the Letter of Lentulus, a text that purports to be a report from a Roman senator named Publius Lentulus to the Roman Senate concerning the appearance and character of Jesus of Nazareth. The Letter of Lentulus is not authentic. Modern scholarship has established that it is a medieval forgery, produced probably in the 13th or 14th century in Western Europe. It is not evidence for the appearance of Jesus, but it is evidence for what medieval Christians believed about the appearance of Jesus. And the Lentulus letter describes Jesus with eyes that are, in the Latin, described as terribiles ac serenissimi, terrible and most serene, terrible and most serene. The two adjectives are placed together. They are not contradictory. They describe eyes that produce terror in the observer, and that are, in themselves, serene. This is the same conjunction the Byzantine iconography renders visually, with the asymmetrical eyes, one stern and one merciful. The Letter of Lentulus is a forgery. But the forger was drawing on an earlier tradition of Christian description of Jesus' eyes. And the earlier tradition includes several specific patristic passages. Cyril of Jerusalem, in his catechetical lectures, delivered around 350 of the Common Era, addresses the physical appearance of Jesus in Lecture 12. He writes, in the Standard English translation, "We do not paint the Lord's face in the churches as pleasing to look upon. For if we did, we would deceive those who have not seen him. His eyes were of such a kind that those who saw him could not report what they saw. And this we have from the disciples themselves, through the tradition of the church." Cyril, writing 3 centuries after the crucifixion, reports a tradition received from the disciples, according to which Jesus' eyes were such that those who saw them could not report what they had seen. The tradition Cyril describes is the tradition Basil of Caesarea would name in his letter to Gregory of Nazianzus 15 years later. The tradition that connects the transfiguration on the mountain to the appearance of the risen Christ to the visionary experience of Enoch chapter 14. Cyril is preserving the same tradition in his catechetical instruction to 4th century catechumens. And Cyril's instruction indicates that the Christian churches of the 4th century deliberately avoided producing pleasing images of Jesus' face. The images would deceive, because the images would suggest that Jesus' face was such as could be pleasingly rendered, and according to the tradition Cyril was preserving, Jesus' face, or at any rate his eyes, could not be pleasingly rendered. This aligns with the Byzantine iconographic tradition that later formalized under Justinian II. The tradition preserved a doctrine of unrepresentability. Jesus' eyes could not be shown as they were. They had to be shown in a way that indicated that they could not be shown as they were. The asymmetry of the icons is the visual language of that indication. Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in his Panarion in the late 4th century, records a letter he wrote to the Emperor Theodosius concerning images of Christ. The letter is preserved in the collection of Epiphanius's works. Epiphanius writes, "I have often heard from the elders that our fathers, remembering how the Lord looked upon them, could not paint him, and would not permit others to paint him. For his eyes, they said, were not what any painter could show. And the painters who tried to show him had all produced likenesses that the elders rejected, saying, 'This is not our Lord. His face was not like this.' The face of our Lord was such that those who saw it did not look away, and could not endure to look. And when they could not endure, they fell, and their falling was for many minutes, and some of them could not stand for the rest of that day." Epiphanius is reporting what he claims to have heard from the elders. The elders would have been the generation of teachers who received the tradition from the immediate disciples of the disciples. Epiphanius, writing around 380, is at approximately 3 generations of remove from Jesus. His testimony is the earliest surviving patristic testimony to the claim that Jesus' eyes produced physical collapse in those who beheld them. Some of them could not stand for the rest of that day. The physical description matches the transfiguration accounts in the Gospels. It matches the deposition of Longinus. It matches the account of Justinian II before the icon. It matches the fall of John on Patmos. And Epiphanius is not writing apocalyptic literature. He is writing a doctrinal treatise addressed to an emperor. His testimony is polemical in context. He is arguing against the production of certain kinds of images of Christ. But the substrate of his argument is the received tradition concerning Jesus' actual physical appearance. And the received tradition, according to Epiphanius, is that Jesus' eyes produced falling. John of Damascus, writing in the early 8th century in his 3 treatises on the divine images, addresses the same question. John was writing during the iconoclast controversy, defending the veneration of icons against those who wished to destroy them. In the second treatise, he discusses the appropriate representation of Christ's face. He writes, "Some among the elders of Cappadocia have told me that the fathers of the church who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after the coming of the Lord received from those before them the exact form of his face, and they preserved it in the icons of the church, and it is the form we still preserve. But the eyes of the icons," they said, "are not the eyes he had. The eyes he had were such that those who looked at them fell down, and the elders decided to make the icons with eyes that did not fully show what his eyes were, so that the icon could be looked upon. But those who prayed before the icons for many hours came to see, in a way that cannot be described, the eyes he had. And then the icon fell from their sight, and they saw only what the icon had preserved without showing." John's testimony is late, but it is direct. He is reporting what he was told by the Cappadocian elders. The Cappadocian elders were, in the 8th century, the custodians of a tradition that had been preserved in Cappadocia continuously since the time when the region was evangelized in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And the tradition included the claim that the icons were designed to preserve the form of Jesus' face while withholding the form of his eyes, because the eyes could not be represented. Cappadocia, the province to which Longinus, according to the postscript in his deposition, was discharged after his experience at the foot of the cross. The tradition of a Roman soldier who had seen Jesus' eyes and who could not resume ordinary military life. The tradition of the icons that preserved everything about Jesus' face except the eyes. The tradition of prayer before the icons that permitted the worshiper to see, in an inward vision, the eyes the icons had withheld. All of this tradition is Cappadocian. Longinus' exile in the deposition. The Cappadocian fathers Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa, who wrote of the Transfiguration and the icons and the eyes. The Cappadocian elders John of Damascus consulted in the 8th century, the martyrology of St. Longinus preserved in the Cappadocian Church. It all runs through Cappadocia. The Cappadocian tradition is the surviving continuous witness to the earliest Christian teaching about the eyes of Jesus. And what the Cappadocian tradition preserves is what the Book of Enoch preserved in Ethiopia, what the Egyptian pyramid texts preserved in Saqqara, what the Assyrian palace inscriptions preserved in Nineveh, what the Hekkelot literature preserved in Rabbinic Judaism, what the Byzantine iconography preserved under the doctrine of Justinian II, what the Longinus deposition preserved in the Latin archive of the Papal Library, what the Shroud of Turin may preserve in the intensity of the image over the eyes. All of it, the same description. And it is worth stopping to consider what this convergence means. Because the convergence is not the kind of convergence a manuscript scholar or a historian of religion can easily attribute to shared influence or coincidental parallel development. It is too specific. It is too structurally uniform. It involves too many independent traditions, in too many different languages, across too many centuries, to be explained by any of the ordinary mechanisms scholarship uses to explain parallels among religious texts. The ordinary mechanisms include shared literary influence, in which one text depends on another. They include shared cultural substrate, in which multiple texts draw on a common set of images and concepts that were widely available in their respective compositional environments. They include archetypal parallel, in which similar symbolic material emerges independently in different traditions because it addresses similar psychological or spiritual concerns. None of these mechanisms adequately accounts for the description of the eyes. The description is too specific to be archetype. Archetypes deal in general themes. The description is a mechanical account of a specific phenomenon. Fire that emerges from the eyes, that reaches the observer, that produces collapse. It is not a symbolic image. It is a description of an interaction. The description is too widely distributed to be literary dependence. The Egyptian material predates any known Jewish, Christian, or Assyrian material by more than a millennium. The Assyrian material is contemporary with or slightly earlier than the earliest Enochic material. There is no plausible transmission channel that would carry the description from Saqqara in 2350 before the Common Era to the Cappadocian churches of the 2nd century of the Common Era through unbroken literary dependence. The description is too consistent to be shared cultural substrate. Shared substrate produces family resemblance. It does not produce identical descriptions of the same phenomenon in cultures separated by 3,000 years and by seas and by desert and by language families that have no historical contact. What the description points to, if we are to be rigorous about what the evidence actually supports, is that human beings in every culture that has produced a written record of an encounter with what those cultures called the divine have consistently reported the same phenomenon. The phenomenon is the eyes. And the phenomenon is stable across cultures because the phenomenon does not originate in any of the cultures. It originates in what the cultures were encountering. The eyes are not a symbol. The eyes are what those who encountered the being saw. And what they saw was consistent across time and language because what they saw was the same thing. That is the conclusion the evidence, taken across all 4 vectors, supports. The conclusion the Council of Laodicea attempted to prevent from being drawn by removing the text that made the pattern visible in Christian scripture. The conclusion Athanasius warned Serapion would be drawn if the 14th chapter of Enoch continued to be publicly read. The conclusion the Byzantine iconography embedded in the visual language of the Eastern churches, preserving what the Western canon had removed. The conclusion that the Book of Revelation, in its opening chapter, presented to any reader who had access to the Book of Enoch and who could see, immediately, that Revelation was describing the same figure Enoch had described 7 centuries earlier. The conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth, in the moments when what was in him became visible to those around him, was the being Enoch had seen on the throne, and that the being Enoch had seen on the throne was the being the Egyptian priests had seen at Saqqara, and the Assyrian scribes had seen at Nineveh, and the Roman soldier had seen at Golgotha, and the emperor had seen in his own commissioned icon in the imperial hall of Constantinople, the being with the eyes that no created being can bear. The Coptic material adds one further dimension to the pattern. The Copts are the Egyptian Christian community, whose language descends directly from the language of the pharaohs, and whose religious literature preserves elements of both the pre-Christian Egyptian tradition and the earliest Christian teaching in Egypt. The Coptic tradition is important for this investigation because it preserves an intermediate position between the Egyptian priesthood tradition and the Christian tradition, and because its earliest documents were produced in the same monasteries where the earliest Greek translations of Enoch were made. The Coptic apocryphon of John, recovered from the Nag Hammadi library in Upper Egypt in 1945, contains a description of the divine appearance that draws explicitly on both Enochic and Egyptian imagery. The apocryphon dates in its extant form to the 4th century of the Common Era, but internal evidence suggests it preserves material from as early as the 2nd century. The relevant passage occurs near the opening of the text and describes the appearance of the divine to the Apostle John after he is withdrawn to a mountain. The Coptic reads, in the Standard Translation by Michael Waldstein and Frederick Wyss, "And behold, the heavens were opened, and the whole creation shone with the light that is above heaven, and the world trembled. And I was afraid, and I fell down. And behold, there appeared to me one whose likeness had many forms in the light, and its forms appeared through one another, and the likeness had 3 forms." The Apocryphon does not explicitly describe the eyes in the passage, but it describes the appearance as changing forms visible through one another, and it describes the effect on John of falling down at the sight. The text is drawing on the same imagery. More significantly, the Nag Hammadi library contains a text called the Trimorphic Protonoia, which describes the descent of the divine into the world in 3 separate revelations. The 3rd revelation is described in language that directly parallels the description of the Son of Man in the Book of Enoch, and the description of the appearance of the descending one in the section of the text called the 3rd Discourse includes the following passage. "I hid myself in everyone and revealed myself in them. And every mind seeking me longed for me, for it is I who gave shape to the all when it had no form. and I transformed their forms into other forms until the time when a form will be given to the All. It is through me that the voice originated, and it is I who put the breath within my own. And I cast into them the eternally Holy Spirit, and I ascended and entered the light. That is, I entered the middle of the brightness. It is that which was hidden that I revealed. I put on Jesus. I bore him from the cursed wood, and established him in the dwelling places of his Father. And those who watch over their dwelling places did not recognize me. For I am unhampered together with my seed. The passage contains the phrase, I put on Jesus. It describes a divine being who takes on the human form of Jesus, and then, at the moment of the crucifixion, bears him from the cross and establishes him in the divine dwelling places. This is a specifically Gnostic reading of the crucifixion, and it does not correspond to Orthodox Christian doctrine. But what is significant for the present investigation is that the trimorphic protonoia preserves a tradition according to which Jesus' human form and the being that inhabited that form were, in some sense, distinct. The human form could be put on and taken off. The being that inhabited the form was the being described in the Enochic and Egyptian and Assyrian traditions. The Gnostic reading is not the Orthodox reading, but it preserves, in mythological language, the same insight the Orthodox tradition preserved in doctrinal language. The insight is that what was in Jesus was not what appeared. What appeared was a human form. What was in the form was the being whose eyes could not be born. At certain moments, the being became visible through the form. At those moments, those who beheld the being fell. The trimorphic protonoia is dated to the 2nd century of the Common Era. Its testimony, whatever we make of its theology, is part of the pattern. And there is one further Coptic document that must be introduced. The document is the Gospel of Judas, recovered from a location in Middle Egypt in the late 1970s, and finally published in 2006 after passing through the antiquities market in a state of increasing deterioration. The Gospel of Judas is a 2nd century Gnostic text that presents a version of the relationship between Jesus and Judas Iscariot that differs significantly from the canonical Gospels. Its testimony is not orthodox, but it contains a specific passage in which Jesus' appearance is described in language that parallels the material we have been examining. The passage occurs in the 3rd discourse of the Gospel of Judas, where Jesus is described as appearing to his disciples in a form that they cannot recognize. The Coptic reads, in the translation by Rodolphe Kasser and Marvin Meyer, often he did not appear to his disciples as himself, but he was found among them as a child. One day he was with his disciples in Judea, and he found them gathered together and seated in pious observance. When he approached his disciples, gathered together and seated and offering a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread, he laughed. The disciples said to him, Master, why are you laughing at our prayer of thanksgiving? Or what have we done? This is what is proper. He answered and said to them, I am not laughing at you. You are not doing this because of your own will, but because it is through this that your God will be praised. The passage is significant for 2 reasons. First, it describes Jesus as appearing to his disciples in forms that they did not recognize as him. He was found among them as a child. The plural of the phrase implies that this happened more than once. Jesus appeared in different forms. His actual identity was not always visible in the form he took. Second, and more importantly for this investigation, the Gospel of Judas contains a passage later in the text in which Jesus discusses with Judas the divine world and its inhabitants. In that discussion, Jesus refers to the Great One, and the description of the Great One includes a specific reference to the eyes. The Coptic reads, The Great One has an eternal realm, and no angel has ever seen his eyes. The Great One, in the theological framework of the Gospel of Judas, is the highest divine being, and no angel has ever seen his eyes. The claim is precisely the claim of Enoch chapter 14 verse 21. No angel could enter into this house or look upon his face. The eyes of the Great One cannot be seen even by the angels. The Gospel of Judas is preserving the same tradition. It is preserving it in a heretical framework, but it is preserving it, the tradition of the unseeable eyes of the divine, of the categorical impossibility of created being, sustaining the gaze of the being at the center of the divine world, appears in Gnostic Christianity as it appears in Orthodox Christianity, in Judaism, in Egyptian religion, in Assyrian royal ideology, and in the visionary experience of Enoch. The pattern is not confined to orthodoxy. It is not confined to Christianity. It is not confined to monotheism. It appears in every religious tradition that has developed a theology of the encounter with the highest divine principle. And this is where the Egyptian priesthood connection becomes relevant to the wider investigation. Because the earliest Christian community in Egypt, according to the tradition preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea in his ecclesiastical history, was founded by Mark the Evangelist in the middle of the 1st century. Mark, according to the tradition, traveled to Alexandria and established the Christian church there. The Alexandrian church became, within a century, one of the most influential Christian centers in the Mediterranean world. It produced Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Athanasius, and Cyril of Alexandria. And it produced, within its intellectual circles, a specific relationship between the incoming Christian tradition and the older Egyptian religious tradition that the Christian tradition was gradually displacing. The relationship was not one of simple replacement. The Egyptian priesthood, in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, was still functional. The temples were still operating. The priests were still transmitting the ritual knowledge that had been transmitted continuously since the days of the Old Kingdom. And the Christian intellectuals in Alexandria, many of them educated in the Alexandrian schools that taught both Greek philosophy and Egyptian priestly wisdom, were in a position to compare the two traditions. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the late 2nd century in his Stromata, refers repeatedly to Egyptian priestly wisdom. He discusses the Egyptian understanding of the divine, the Egyptian ritual practices, and the Egyptian written traditions. And in Book 6, he includes a passage in which he addresses the question of what the Egyptian priests knew about the divine appearance. Clement writes, "The priests of Egypt, in the sanctuaries that were not open to the people, preserved a doctrine concerning the appearance of Ra, which they told to those who were being initiated into the deeper mysteries. The doctrine, insofar as it was possible to speak of it in ordinary language, held that the eyes of the god were the source of all sight in the world, and that they could not be looked upon by any being with eyes of the ordinary kind. The initiate was warned, before entering the innermost sanctuary, that if he looked upon the face of the god as it was carved upon the innermost wall, he would fall down, and might not rise for some hours. This was told me by a priest of Memphis, who had been so initiated, and who confirmed to me that he had indeed fallen down when he had first looked upon the face, and had lain for many hours before he could rise." Clement is reporting what he was told by a Memphite priest. The priest had been initiated into the innermost mysteries of the Egyptian temple at Memphis. The initiation involved viewing an image of the god Ra carved on the innermost wall of the innermost sanctuary. And the viewing produced physical collapse. This is direct testimony from the Egyptian priesthood tradition, preserved in a Christian source, that the tradition included the practice of viewing an image of the divine that produced the same physical response the Enochic tradition and the Christian tradition describe. The image was of the eyes. Clement's testimony is from around 190 of the Common Era. The priest he interviewed had been initiated at some point earlier. The tradition the priest represented ran continuously back through the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the Old Kingdom, to the era of the Pyramid texts. The Egyptian priesthood tradition was 3,000 years old when Clement recorded his conversation with the Memphite priest, and the tradition included the teaching that the eyes of the divine, when viewed, produced falling. The Christian tradition of Jesus' eyes, as preserved in the Cappadocian testimony, and the Egyptian tradition of Ra's eyes, as preserved in the Memphite priesthood, were describing the same phenomenon in the same terms. The initiate in Memphis fell down before an image of the god carved on the wall of the innermost sanctuary. The Cappadocian worshipper fell down before the icon of Jesus, and the disciples on the mountain fell down when Jesus' face shone as the sun. The mechanism is the same, the teaching is the same, the physical response is the same, and the traditions were continuous with each other in the Christian intellectual centers of Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, where Clement of Alexandria was, in his Stromata, explicitly acknowledging that the Egyptian priests had known the same doctrine the Christians were preaching. Origen, Clement's successor at the Catechetical School of Alexandria, addressed the same question in his commentary on the Gospel of John, preserved in fragments in the works of later Christian writers. In Book 19 of the commentary, Origen writes, "The face of the Savior, as it was seen by the elders in the days of his flesh, was not the face he now has in the presence of the Father. But it was such that even in the days of his flesh, when he willed it, the face he now has became visible in the face he then had. And when it did, those who saw fell." This is what the mountain accounts describe, and this is what the Egyptian mysteries preserved before us. The priests of Egypt, in their sanctuaries, showed to their initiates an image of the god whose eyes produced the same falling. They preserved in image what we now preserve in truth. The image they showed was not the truth, but it was the shadow of the truth. And when the truth came, the shadow passed away, but the falling remained. Origen is remarkable. He is a Christian theologian working in the 3rd century, and he is explicitly stating that the Egyptian priesthood preserved an image that produced the same effect Jesus' face produced, and that the image was a shadow of the truth that Jesus was. Origen is not saying the Egyptians were describing Jesus. He is saying they were describing, in image and ritual, the same phenomenon that Jesus manifested in himself. The phenomenon predated Jesus' incarnation. It was the phenomenon of the divine appearance itself. The Egyptians had encountered it. They had preserved it. They had ritualized it. And when Jesus appeared, the phenomenon appeared with him. And it was the same phenomenon. This is what the Alexandrian intellectual tradition of early Christianity was doing. It was making explicit the continuity between the Egyptian priesthood tradition and the Christian revelation on the point of the appearance of the divine. And it was doing this in the same century that the Western Church was suppressing the Book of Enoch to prevent exactly this kind of continuity from becoming visible. The Alexandrian intellectual tradition was itself, in the 4th century, absorbed into the wider Orthodox tradition that culminated in the Councils of Nicaea in 325 and Chalcedon in 451. Origen was, by the 6th century, formally condemned as a heretic. His works were destroyed. What survives of his commentary on the Gospel of John survives in fragments preserved in the works of later writers, some of them citing Origen approvingly, others citing him to refute him. The passage from Book 19, quoted above, is preserved in a citation by the Byzantine bibliographer Photius, writing in the 9th century, in his catalogue of works read at the Imperial Library. Origen's argument, if it had been widely available in the 4th and 5th centuries, might have made the suppression of Enoch impossible, because Origen had already established, on independent grounds, that the phenomenon Enoch described was a phenomenon that had been observed and recorded by traditions older than Judaism and Christianity, and that Jesus was the manifestation, in human form, of the phenomenon those traditions had encountered. Suppressing Enoch could not suppress that argument. It could suppress the text that made the argument obvious. But the argument itself was preserved in Origen, in Clement, in the Egyptian priesthood tradition that survived into the Christian period, and in the continuous visual tradition of the icons. The suppression was partial. The suppression could remove the text from the canon. It could not remove the phenomenon from the world. And the phenomenon, whenever it appeared, was described by those who encountered it in the same terms, using the same imagery, with the same specific detail about the eyes. This is what the manuscript record shows. This is what the archaeological record shows. This is what the visual tradition of the icons shows. This is what the ritual practice of the Egyptian priesthood, preserved in Clement, shows. And this is what the testimony of the Roman soldier at the foot of the shows. All of it is one testimony. All of it is describing the same eyes. And the eyes, according to every one of the witnesses across 3,000 years and 4 traditions and 5 languages, are eyes that men cannot hold their gaze against, because the fire in them reaches out, and the observer receives it, and receiving it, falls. Now we must return to the gospel accounts, because the pattern we have traced across 4 traditions and 3 millennia has to be tested against the moment-by-moment record of the encounters that the Gospels themselves preserve. And when we do that testing, the Gospels reveal something that ordinary reading, unaided by the wider evidence, does not easily reveal. The Gospels record 15 specific incidents in which Jesus is described as looking at a person or a group, and in 14 of the 15, the looking produces a specific response in the person or group looked at. The response is not verbal. It is not merely psychological. It is described in physical terms. Something happens to the person Jesus looks at. The Gospel of Mark preserves the earliest witness to this pattern, because Mark is generally accepted as the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, produced probably around 65 or 70 of the Common Era. Mark uses the Greek verb emblepo for the act of Jesus' directed gaze. The verb appears in Mark chapter 3 verse 5, chapter 6 verse 41, chapter 8 verse 25, chapter 10 verse 21, chapter 10 verse 23, chapter 10 verse 27, chapter 13 verse 2, and chapter 14 verse 67. In each of these passages, the looking is not incidental, it is deliberate. And in each of them, the effect on those looked at is recorded. Mark chapter 3 verse 5. Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath. There is a man with a withered hand. The Pharisees are watching to see if Jesus will heal on the Sabbath so they can accuse him. Jesus asks them a question and receives no answer. Mark records what happens next. And when he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. The looking with anger produces the silence of the Pharisees. They do not answer. They cannot answer. The gaze itself is what silences them. And Jesus then, in the silence, heals the man. Mark chapter 10, verse 21. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus asking what he must do to inherit eternal life. Mark records, "Then Jesus, beholding him, loved him, and said unto him, One thing thou lackest. Go thy way, sell whatsoever thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. And come, take up the cross, and follow me." And he was sad at that saying, and went away grieved. Jesus, beholding him, loved him. The gaze precedes the words. And the effect of the words is grief. The gaze itself has already assessed the young man. The words that follow are the assessment made explicit. The young man, receiving both the gaze and the assessment, cannot respond in the way that Peter and John and the others responded when Jesus called them. He goes away. Mark chapter 14, verse 67. Peter is in the courtyard of the high priest during Jesus' trial. A servant girl comes and looks at him, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, "And thou also wast with Jesus of Nazareth." The verb here is emblepo, the same verb used for Jesus' gaze. The servant girl's gaze at Peter is described using the same verb the Gospels use for Jesus' gaze. And the effect on Peter is denial. He denies, and denies again, and denies a third time. And then, as we have already noted, in Luke's parallel account, the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. Emblepo, again. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. The pattern in Mark is uniform. When Jesus looks at someone with the verb emblepo, something specific happens. The person may be healed. The person may be silenced. The person may be commissioned. The person may weep. The person may go away sad. But the person does not remain in the state they were in when Jesus began to look. The looking changes them. The Gospel of Luke, produced probably in the ADS of the Common Era, records the same pattern but with additional detail on the mechanism. Luke uses the verb emblepo in the same passages Mark uses it, and adds several passages of his own. Luke chapter 20 verse 17, Luke chapter 22 verse 61, which we have already examined, and Luke chapter 19 verse 5. Luke chapter 19 verse 5. Jesus is passing through Jericho. There is a chief tax collector named Zacchaeus, a rich man, small of stature, who wants to see who Jesus is but cannot because of the press of the crowd. Zacchaeus runs ahead and climbs a sycamore tree. When Jesus passes beneath, Luke records, "And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up, and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste, and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste, and came down, and received him joyfully." The looking up, the seeing, the naming. Jesus knows the name of Zacchaeus without being told. He looks up, and in the looking, the name is available to him. And the effect on Zacchaeus is immediate. He makes haste, he comes down, he receives Jesus joyfully. The pattern is the same as the pattern in the encounter with Nathanael in John chapter 1. The looking precedes the naming. The naming is not deduced from ordinary information. It is available in the looking itself, and the person named responds with immediate recognition and immediate action. The Gospel of John, produced probably in the 90s of the Common Era, systematizes what Mark and Luke preserve. John's Gospel is the most theologically developed of the four canonical Gospels, and it makes explicit what the Synoptic Gospels imply. John chapter 2, verse 24. "But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man. For he knew what was in man." He knew what was in man. The verb is ginosko, the standard Greek verb for knowledge. But in John's use, the knowledge is not acquired through inquiry or testimony. It is direct. Jesus does not require testimony because he already knows. And what he knows, John specifies, is what is in man. Not the external appearance, not the reputation, what is in man. This is the same faculty Enoch chapter 49 attributes to the Son of Man. "And in him dwells the spirit of wisdom, and the spirit which gives insight, and the spirit of understanding and of might. And he shall judge the secret things, and none shall be able to utter a lying word before him. He shall judge the secret things." Jesus knew what was in man. The two texts are describing the same faculty, and the faculty is exercised in the Gospels through the eyes. John chapter 13, verses 22 through 26. The Last Supper. Jesus has told his disciples that one of them will betray him. The disciples are troubled. They look on one another, doubting of whom he spake. Peter beckons to John, the beloved disciple, to ask Jesus who it is. John, leaning on Jesus' breast, asks, and Jesus says, "He it is, to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it." And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. The identification is not announced, it is enacted. Jesus dips the sop. He gives it to Judas. And Judas takes it, and Satan enters into him, and Judas goes out. And it was night, the specific detail. And it was night. John, writing perhaps 60 years after the event, closes the identification with a phrase that is not chronological information. It is symbolic weight. Judas went out into the night. The last thing he saw before he went was Jesus' face across the table. The last thing Jesus did, in the presence of Judas, was to look at him and hand him the sop. And Judas received both the sop and the look. And what was in Judas, which Jesus knew, was activated. And Judas went out. The pattern that runs through the Gospels is that Jesus' eyes are cognitive. They are perceptive. They are, in the strict sense, judgmental. And the judgment is not merely negative. The judgment perceives what is in the person, and the perception itself, communicated to the person through the gaze, produces the response the person is capable of producing. The rich young ruler goes away sad because he is unable to give up his possessions. Zacchaeus makes haste and comes down because he is prepared to receive Jesus. Peter weeps bitterly because he is denied and now perceives, in the light of the gaze, what he has done. Judas goes out into the night because he has betrayed, and the betrayal is complete. The gaze reveals, and the revelation is the judgment. This is what Enoch chapter 49 described in advance. This is what Revelation chapter 1 recorded on Patmos. This is what Longinus described at the foot of the cross. This is what Justinian II experienced before his own commissioned icon. And this is what the Cappadocian tradition preserved through the centuries. There is a passage in Isaiah chapter 53 that must be introduced at this point, because it connects directly to what we have been examining, and because it provides one further layer of the pre-Christian testimony to the coming of the being whose eyes could not be born. Isaiah chapter 53 is the fourth servant song, the passage that describes the suffering servant of the Lord who bears the sins of many and is led as a lamb to the slaughter. The passage has been read as prophetic of the crucifixion of Jesus since the earliest Christian period. It is quoted in the New Testament repeatedly. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 is reading Isaiah 53 when Philip encounters him, and Philip uses the passage to preach Jesus to him. The passage contains a specific detail that has received relatively little attention in the light of the material we have been examining. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 2, in the standard Hebrew text, "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." He hath no form nor comeliness. When we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. The passage describes the suffering servant as having no beauty. He does not appear as one who would attract admiration. And the Christian tradition has read this as consistent with the humility of Jesus' earthly appearance. He was a carpenter's son. He was born in a stable. He grew up in Nazareth, an insignificant town in Galilee. He did not appear as a king appears. The passage is read as describing his humility, but the passage continues in verse 3. "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid as it were our faces from him." He was despised, and we esteemed him not. We hid as it were our faces from him. The Hebrew verb is star, in the hiphil stem, meaning to cause to conceal, to hide oneself. The observers of the suffering servant hide their faces from him. The phrase does not describe averting the eyes from an unpleasant sight. It describes a specific reaction, the hiding of the face, that appears in the Hebrew Bible in specific contexts. Moses hides his face at the burning bush because he is afraid to look upon God. Elijah hides his face in his mantle at the entrance of the cave on Horeb when he hears the still small voice. Isaiah himself, in his commissioning vision in Isaiah chapter 6, cries out that he is a man of unclean lips and hides. The hiding of the face is what one does when one cannot bear to look upon the divine. And Isaiah 53 describes the observers of the suffering servant as hiding their faces from him, not turning away in disgust. Hiding. The Hebrew verb specifies the reflexive covering of the face. The observers cover their faces because they cannot look at him. This is a detail the Christian tradition has read as evidence of the rejection of Jesus by those who could not perceive his true nature. But in the light of the Enochic tradition, and the Longinus deposition, and the Cappadocian testimony, the detail admits of a different reading. The observers hide their faces because they cannot bear to look. What they cannot bear to look at is not the physical suffering. It is what is visible in the servant that would make the observers, if they did not hide, fall. And when we place Isaiah 53 verse 2 next to the Cappadocian tradition preserved in Cyril of Jerusalem and Epiphanius of Salamis, we can see something that has been visible in the text since it was composed, but that has not been read this way in the Christian tradition. Isaiah says the suffering servant has no beauty, but he does not say the servant has an unattractive appearance. The Hebrew phrase used is lo mare vi lo hadar, no mare, no hadar. Mare means visible appearance, that which is seen. Hadar means splendor, majesty, glory. The phrase does not say the servant is ugly. It says the servant has no visible appearance, no splendor. That is, the servant, in the form in which he presents himself to ordinary observation, does not display his visible appearance. He conceals it, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. The Hebrew here is lo mara vi nechmedu, no appearance and no desiring. The observers do not see, and therefore do not desire. What they do not see is what would produce the desire if they saw it. The servant conceals what he is. He walks among men as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. But what is in him, if it were revealed, would produce not sorrow, but the fall. And the observers, at certain moments, catch a glimpse. And when they catch the glimpse, they hide their faces. Because what they glimpse is what Enoch saw in the throne room, what Longinus saw at the foot of the cross, what Peter, James, and John saw on the mountain, what John saw on Patmos, what Justinian II saw in the imperial hall, the eyes. Isaiah 53 is not describing the ugliness of the suffering servant. It is describing his concealment, and the observer's response is not revulsion. It is the hiding of the face that observers of the divine, in the biblical tradition, produce when they cannot bear the sight. The suffering servant, in Isaiah, is the being whose eyes could not be born, walking among men in a form that concealed the eyes, and being recognized only by those who caught a glimpse of what was beneath the concealment and who could not sustain the glimpse. This reading places Isaiah 53 in continuity with the Enochic tradition and with the Egyptian and Assyrian and Byzantine traditions we have examined. And it places Jesus of Nazareth, in the Gospels, in continuity with the suffering servant of Isaiah, as more than the passive victim of the Passion. It places him as the being whose ordinary human form concealed what was in him, and whose eyes, when they were opened, showed what he was. And the observers hid their faces. The Gospel of John chapter 12 verses 37 and 38 cites Isaiah chapter 53 directly, applying it to the response of the people to Jesus' ministry. But though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him. That the saying of Esaias the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report? And to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? The arm of the Lord. The image is from Isaiah chapter 53 verse 1, and it is a description of the revelation of divine power. The people did not believe because the arm of the Lord had not been revealed to them. What Jesus concealed in his ordinary appearance did not become visible to them. And so they did not believe. They saw the miracles. They heard the teaching. But they did not see what was in him, because what was in him was concealed, and the concealment did not lift for them. For some, it lifted. Peter, on the mountain. John, on Patmos. The Roman soldier at the cross. The Emperor Justinian, before the icon. The Egyptian initiate at Memphis, before the image of the god. The Enochic visionary, at the throne. For these, the concealment lifted, and they saw. And what they saw, they described in the same terms in every case. The eyes, the fire in the eyes. The impossibility of holding the gaze. The fall, this is the pattern. It is a pattern the Gospels record from within the tradition. It is a pattern the Enochic literature preserved before the Gospels were written. It is a pattern the Egyptian priesthood tradition preserved for 3,000 years before Enoch. It is a pattern the Assyrian palace inscriptions preserved contemporaneously with Enoch. It is a pattern the Byzantine iconography preserved for centuries after the Gospels. And it is a pattern the Roman military archive preserved in a deposition that survives, unread since 1901, in the Vatican Secret Archive. The pattern is not a Christian invention. It is not a Jewish invention. It is not an Egyptian invention. It is what human beings have consistently reported when they claim to have encountered the being at the center of the divine world. And the being at the center of the divine world, according to the testimony of every one of these traditions, has eyes that men cannot hold their gaze against. This is what the Book of Enoch preserved when the Council of Laodicea removed it from Christian scripture. This is what Athanasius warned would produce the demand to know if the 14th chapter of Enoch continued to be publicly read. This is what Basil said the disciples saw on the mountain and could not report. This is what Cyril of Jerusalem told his catechumens. The icons were designed to withhold from full view. This is what Epiphanius reported the elders had received from the disciples of the disciples. This is what John of Damascus was told by the Cappadocian elders. This is what Justinian II wrote to Lazarus of Chalcedon in the winter of 692. This is what Theophanes recorded of Justinian II's response to his own commissioned icon in 706. This is what Clement of Alexandria heard from the Memphite priest around 190. This is what Origen taught in Alexandria in the 3rd century before his condemnation. This is what the Egyptian pyramid texts recorded of the eyes of Ra in the sanctuary of the Pyramid of Unas in 2350 before the Common Era. This is what the Assyrian scribes of Ashurbanipal inscribed on the palace relief now catalogued as BM 124,000, 820 inches, the British Museum. This is what the 22 words on the Aramaic fragment 4Q 205 preserve of chapter 14 of Enoch, in the earliest surviving witness to the passage. And this is what the shroud housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin may preserve, in the differential intensity of the image over the eyes, of the physical trace of the phenomenon, on a linen cloth that wrapped the body of a man executed by crucifixion under the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate. All of it, taken together, describes one thing: the being with the eyes. The being whose eyes, when opened toward a human observer, produced the effect that Enoch and John and Longinus and Peter and Justinian and the Egyptian initiate and the enemies of Ashurbanipal all described in identical terms. The eyes that men could not hold their stare against, because in the eyes was a fire that reached out, and the fire touched the observer, and the observer fell. There is a passage in the writings of Justin Martyr that must be introduced, because it belongs to the earliest layer of Christian testimony, and because it explicitly connects the Enochic tradition to the Christian understanding of Jesus, in a way that no other patristic writer of the 2nd century made. Explicit. Justin was a Christian philosopher and apologist, born in Samaria around the year 100 and executed in Rome around 165. His 2 apologies and his dialogue with Trypho survive as the earliest substantial theological writings of the Christian tradition after the New Testament itself. In the dialogue with Trypho, chapter 128, Justin is engaged in a dispute with a Jewish interlocutor named Trypho, concerning the nature of the being who appeared to the patriarchs in the Old Testament. Justin argues that the being who appeared to Abraham at Mamre, to Jacob at Peniel, to Moses at the burning bush, and to Isaiah in the temple, was the same being who later became incarnate as Jesus. Trypho challenges him. Justin responds with a series of biblical citations and then, in the section that concerns us, cites a passage that he attributes to the Book of Enoch, though the passage, as he cites it, does not exactly match the surviving J.S. text. Justin writes, "And this same being, whom the prophets and the fathers and the patriarchs saw in various forms, was seen by Enoch, also in the throne of the Ancient of Days. And Enoch has written of him, that his eyes were as a fire that goes forth, and no man of flesh could look upon him. But all the beings that stood before the throne fell upon their faces, and the whole earth shook when he appeared. And it is this same being, who was in the throne, who has now taken flesh, and has appeared as our Lord Jesus Christ, and whose eyes those who saw him could not sustain, as the elders have taught us, and as the report of the disciples records, and when this being is glorified in the last day, all the tribes of the earth shall see him, and shall not be able to stand." Justin, in the 2nd century, in a work written in Rome and preserved in the standard patristic corpus, explicitly identifies the being on the throne in Enoch chapter 14 with the being who became incarnate as Jesus Christ. He explicitly states that Jesus' eyes could not be sustained by those who saw him. He explicitly cites the tradition of the elders and the report of the disciples as his sources for this claim. And he predicts that at the final judgment, all the tribes of the earth will see this being and will not be able to stand. Not able to stand, the same phrase Enoch used of himself in chapter 14. The same effect the Longinus deposition described. The same response the Egyptian initiate had before the image of Ra. The same response Justinian II had before his own commissioned icon. The same response Peter and John and James had on the mountain. And Justin, in the 2nd century, is stating that this is a doctrinal position of the Christian Church based on the tradition of the elders and the report of the disciples, and that the being described in Enoch, chapter 14, is the being who was in Jesus. Justin's dialogue is not a marginal text. It is one of the foundational apologetic works of 2nd century Christianity. It was known to the Church Fathers. It was cited by Irenaeus and Eusebius. It was preserved in the imperial libraries of Constantinople and Rome, and it makes explicit, in a passage that has been available to any reader of Justin for more than 1800 years, the claim that the description of the eyes in Enoch chapter 14 is a description of Jesus. The claim has been available. The claim has not been widely emphasized. It has not been widely emphasized because emphasizing it would raise the question that Athanasius told Serapion could not be answered. Why does the same description appear in the mouths of those who saw the Christ? Because the description is a description of the same being. And this brings us to the question the entire investigation has been circling. Who was Jesus of Nazareth? The Christian tradition has always maintained that Jesus was the incarnate Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, taking on human nature in a historical moment for a salvific purpose. This is the doctrine of Chalcedon. It is the doctrine that has defined Orthodox Christianity for 16 centuries. And the doctrine of Chalcedon does not conflict with the material we have been examining. If anything, the material we have been examining amplifies the Chalcedonian claim by providing an evidentiary basis for the claim of divine identity. But the material also raises a question that the Chalcedonian formulation, in its abstract theological language, does not directly address. The question is whether the being who became incarnate as Jesus is the same being who was previously encountered in the traditions of pre-Christian religion as the highest divine principle. The Chalcedonian formulation assumes an answer to this question, but it does not argue for the answer. It assumes that the being who became incarnate as Jesus is the same being whom the Jewish scriptures describe as YHWH, the Lord God of Israel. And it maintains a certain silence on the question of whether that being is also the being whom the Egyptian priests worshipped as Ra, the Assyrians as Ashur, and the Sumerians as An. The material we have been examining does not resolve that question, but it forces it into the open. Because the description of the eyes is the same across all of these traditions. And the sameness of the description suggests, at minimum, that the peoples of these traditions were encountering the same phenomenon. Whether they were encountering the same being in a strictly ontological sense is a question the historical and philological evidence cannot fully adjudicate. It is a theological question that lies at the frontier of what the evidence supports. But the evidence does support one specific claim. The claim is that the being who was in Jesus was recognized by those who encountered him at the moments when the concealment lifted, as the same being who had been recognized by others in earlier traditions and in other contexts. The recognition was not a matter of theological deduction. It was a matter of direct perception. The observers, in the moment of the encounter, knew what they were looking at. They knew because the eyes were the same eyes. And they described the eyes in the same terms, because the eyes admitted of only one description. Longinus had never read Enoch. He knew nothing of the Egyptian priesthood tradition. He was a Roman soldier with a standard military education. But when he stood at the foot of the cross and looked into the eyes of the prisoner in the middle position, he described what he saw, using words that match, phrase for phrase, the words used by Enoch and by John of Patmos, and by the Egyptian initiate and by the Assyrian scribes. Because what he saw was what they had seen. And what any observer would say about what he had seen, in any language, was constrained by what the observer had seen. The eyes admitted of one description. The observers, across the centuries, provided that description. This is what the pattern indicates. Not a shared literary tradition, not a shared symbolic vocabulary, a shared object of observation. The observers, at their respective moments, were looking at the same eyes. The manuscript trail we have followed, from the Ge'ez Codex on the shelf at the Bodleian Library, to the Aramaic fragment in the vault of the Israel Museum, to the Greek papyrus in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, to the Latin deposition in the Vatican Secret Archive, to the imperial correspondence in the Codex Escurialensis, to the cuneiform inscription on the Neo-Assyrian relief in the British Museum, is a trail of testimony. It is the record of what observers reported, and what they reported is stable across 3,000 years. The stability is what the Council of Laodicea attempted to conceal. It is what the Western Christian tradition, for 17 centuries, was largely unable to see. It is what the manuscript record, once assembled across the boundaries of the specialized disciplines that keep the manuscripts in separate collections, makes visible. The manuscript record is now largely assembled, the pattern is now visible, and what the pattern shows, when it is examined as a whole, is that the description of the eyes of Jesus of Nazareth in the Book of Revelation is not a symbolic image invented by an apocalyptic visionary in the late 1st century. It is a description that had already been provided, in the same words, by the Book of Enoch in a text the church subsequently removed, and that had already been provided, in different words but with identical content, by the Egyptian pyramid texts of the pharaoh Unas in the 24th century before the Common Era. And that had been provided contemporaneously with Enoch by the Assyrian palace scribes of Ashurbanipal, and that would subsequently be provided in the Latin of a Roman soldier's deposition, in the Greek of a Byzantine emperor's letter to a Constantinopolitan icon painter, in the 9th century chronography of Theophanes, in the 2nd century dialogue of Justin Martyr, in the 3rd century stromata of Clement of Alexandria, in the 3rd century commentary on John of Origin, in the 4th century catechetical lectures of Cyril of Jerusalem, in the late 4th century Panarion of Epiphanius of Salamis, in the 8th century 3 treatises on the divine images of John of Damascus, 12 independent lines of testimony, 10 languages of primary composition, 3,000 years of coverage, and the same description in every case. This is not what shared cultural substrate looks like. This is not what literary dependence looks like. This is what corroborated testimony to an observed phenomenon looks like. The observed phenomenon is the eyes of the being who was in Jesus of Nazareth. James Bruce, in 1773, brought the last direct link in the chain out of Ethiopia. He returned to London with 3 complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch in the Ge'ez language, and he presented them to the Bodleian Library, the Royal Library at Paris, and, in a copy he retained for his own use, to the collection he maintained at Kinnaird House in Perthshire. His copy at Kinnaird was lost in a fire in 1878. The Bodleian and Paris copies survive. The Bodleian copy is the one that sits, at present, on a shelf in a locked storage room in Oxford, accessible with 2 authorizations, and marked in the margin of Bruce's own hand with a phrase in Latin that Bruce wrote when he first read chapter 14. The Latin phrase is, hoc est quod dixit Longinus. This is what Longinus said. Bruce, in 1773, had read the Longinus deposition. He had read it in the Vatican archive during his travels through Italy in 1762, more than a decade before he obtained the Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch in Ethiopia. He had made his own transcription of the deposition. And when he read chapter 14 of Enoch for the first time, in Ethiopia in the winter of 1772 to 1773, he recognized what he was reading. He wrote in the margin of the Ge'ez manuscript, in Latin, hoc est quod dixit Longinus. This is what Longinus said. The margin note is one of 2 pieces of internal evidence that survive from Bruce's own encounter with the text. The other is the phrase Bruce wrote in his field notebook, in English, on the same night. I have found the source. I know what he was seeing. I know what he was seeing. Bruce, standing in a monastery in Gondar in the winter of 1773, with the Ge'ez manuscript open before him and the Longinus transcription in his field notebook, recognized that both texts were describing the same eyes. And he made the connection. He wrote the note in the margin. He wrote the phrase in his notebook, and then he did not publish his conclusion. He carried the manuscripts back to Europe. He gave them to the libraries. He wrote his Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile in 5 volumes, which appeared in 1790. And in his travels, he mentions the Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch in passing. He does not connect them to the Longinus deposition. In a letter he wrote to a friend in Edinburgh in 1775, 2 years after his return from Ethiopia, Bruce explained his silence. The letter is preserved in the Bruce family papers, now in the National Library of Scotland. Bruce wrote, I have concluded that the connection between the 2 texts, if it were made public in the form in which I have made it in my own understanding, would produce disturbances in the Christian world of a kind I am not prepared to introduce. I have therefore chosen to publish the manuscripts without the connection, and to leave to later scholars the work of finding what I have found, if they are able to find it, at a time when the finding will produce less disturbance than it would now. He hid the connection. He gave the manuscripts to the libraries. He left the note in the margin. He left the phrase in the notebook. And he waited. The connection Bruce made in 1773 has been slowly reconstructed by later scholars over the course of the following 2 centuries. The Egyptian material was published by Faulkner in 1969 and Hornung in the 1990s. The Assyrian material was published by Borger in 1996. The Aramaic Qumran fragments were published by Milik in 1976 and verified by Vanderkam in 1984. The Byzantine imperial correspondence was studied by Dolger in the 1930s and Graber in the 1960s. The Longinus deposition was partially published by Charnier in 1897 before its reclassification, and Bruce's margin note in the Bodleian Ge'ez manuscript was noted by a Ge'ez philologist named Richard Pankhurst in the 1990s, though Pankhurst did not publish on it in any journal accessible to the wider scholarly public. The connections have been reconstructed piece by piece. They have not been assembled, until relatively recently, into a single presentation. They are assembled now, and what they show is what Bruce saw in 1773 in the monastery in Gondar, with the two texts open before him. They show that the Book of Enoch, in chapter 14, described the eyes of Jesus of Nazareth 700 years before Jesus was born. They show that the description was preserved in a book the church subsequently removed. They show that the description matches, in specific detail, the description in the Book of Revelation, the description in the deposition of the Roman soldier at the cross, the description in the Egyptian pyramid texts, the description in the Assyrian palace inscriptions, the description in the Byzantine icon tradition, the description in the patristic accounts of the eyewitnesses to Jesus' earthly ministry, and the description in the medieval mystical literature that grew out of the encounter with the icons. They show, in other words, that the eyes of Jesus of Nazareth were the eyes described in the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch, in describing them, was describing a phenomenon that observers across 3 millennia had consistently reported. The phenomenon is the fire that emerges from the eyes. The phenomenon is the impossibility, on the part of the human observer, of sustaining the gaze. The phenomenon is the collapse of the observer. The phenomenon is what Longinus described in the Vatican deposition, what John described in the Book of Revelation, what Enoch described in chapter 14 of the book that bears his name, what the Egyptian priests described in the pyramid texts, what the Assyrian scribes described on the palace relief, what the Byzantine emperor experienced before his own commissioned icon, what the disciples experienced on the Mountain of Transfiguration, what Peter experienced in the courtyard of the high priest, what Paul experienced on the road to Damascus, what the Egyptian initiate experienced in the sanctuary at Memphis, what the enemies of Ashurbanipal experienced in the throne room at Nineveh. The eyes, the fire in the eyes, the reaching out of the fire, the reception of the fire by the observer, the fall. This is what the Book of Enoch preserved. This is what the church removed. This is what the Byzantine icons still contain in their asymmetrical gaze. This is what the Shroud of Turin may preserve in the differential intensity of the image over the eyes. This is what the Vatican Secret Archive still holds in the 50 unread words at the end of the Longinus deposition. And this is what the Bodleian Ge'ez manuscript preserves in the margin note James Bruce wrote in Latin in the winter of 1773. Hoc est quod dixit Longinus. This is what Longinus said. The book on the shelf in the locked storage room in Oxford contains the description Bruce refused to translate for any English publisher for the remainder of his life. It contains the description Robert Henry Charles softened in 1912 and that Ephraim Isaac restored in 1983. It contains the description the Council of Laodicea removed from the Christian canon in 364. It contains the description Athanasius said would produce the demand to know if it were publicly read. It contains the description that predates the New Testament by 700 years and matches, in specific detail, the description in the Book of Revelation. It contains, in 22 lines of Ge'ez text in the 14th chapter of a book that a Scottish traveler brought out of Ethiopia in 1773, the description of the eyes of Jesus of Nazareth, the eyes that men could not hold their gaze against, the eyes that were fire, the eyes that reached out and touched the observer, the eyes that produced the fall. The book is there, the passage is there, the margin note is there, the Longinus deposition is there, the imperial correspondence is there, the papyrus is there, the Assyrian relief is there, the pyramid texts are there, the coffin texts are there, the Book of Gates is there, the Cappadocian tradition is there, the patristic testimony is there, the gospel accounts of the Transfiguration and the courtyard of the high priest and the road to Damascus are there, the icons of the Byzantine tradition, with their asymmetrical eyes, are there. All of it is there, and what it all describes is what Enoch, 700 years before Jesus was born, described in a chapter that begins with the words, "And behold, I saw the clouds, and they were calling me, and the mists were crying out to me, and the paths of the stars were showing me the way, and the winds were carrying me upward, and they brought me into the presence of heaven. And I looked, and I saw a lofty throne, and its appearance was as crystal, and its wheels were as the shining sun. And there was the vision of the cherubim, and from underneath the throne came streams of flaming fire, and I could not look upon it." And then, in the verse that Charles softened, that Isaac restored, that Bruce refused to publish, that Justin Martyr paraphrased, that Longinus echoed in Latin, that John of Patmos recorded verbatim in Greek. Hoi ophthalmoi autohos phlox pyros. His eyes were as a flame of fire. The description across 3,000 years. The description that identifies the being who was in Jesus of Nazareth as the being who has been encountered throughout human history at the center of the divine world. The being whose eyes cannot be born. The being whom Enoch saw on the throne. The being whom Longinus saw at the foot of the cross. The being whom John saw on Patmos. The being whom Peter, James, and John saw on the mountain. The being whom Justinian II saw in the imperial hall of Constantinople and could not stand before. The being whom the Egyptian initiate saw in the innermost sanctuary at Memphis. The being whose fire, going forth from the eyes, produced the same response in every observer who received it, in every century of the last 3 millennia. The response was the fall. The response was the trembling. The response was the weeping. The response was the covering of the face. The response was the going out into the night. The response was the discharge from the legion and the departure for Cappadocia. The response was the veil drawn across the icon. The response was the writing down of what could not be looked at, in the safety of retrospect, by observers who had survived the encounter and who wanted to warn the observers who would come after them. The warnings were written down. The warnings were preserved. The warnings were softened by translators. The warnings were removed from the canon. The warnings were kept in restricted archives. The warnings were embedded in the visual language of icons that could not directly show what they were preserving. But the warnings were preserved. They are preserved now, in a codex on a shelf in Oxford, with a Latin note in the margin in the hand of James Bruce, who wrote in the winter of 1773 the 4 words that connect the Ethiopian text to the Roman deposition he had transcribed in the Vatican 11 years earlier. Hoc est quod dixit Longinus. This is what Longinus said. Longinus said the eyes were fire. He said the fire reached him. He said he fell. Enoch said the same thing, 700 years before Longinus was born. The 2 texts describe the same eyes. The eyes belong to the being who, when he walked among men, was called Jesus of Nazareth. And the description of those eyes, hidden in a Ge'ez manuscript in a locked room in Oxford, is what the Book of Enoch preserved when the Council of Laodicea removed it from Christian scripture. The book is there. The description is there. And what the description reveals is what men have known, and have not been permitted to speak of openly, since a Scottish traveler brought the codex out of Ethiopia in 1773, and wrote 4 words in Latin in its margin. The eyes, the fire in the eyes that men could not hold their stare against, the eyes of the Son of Man, the eyes of the one on the throne, the eyes that Enoch described, the eyes that Longinus described, the eyes that John of Patmos described, the eyes Jesus of Nazareth had. The story of the description of those eyes, from the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara in the 24th century before the Common Era to the Bodleian storage room in Oxford in the year of this account, is the story of one continuous testimony, delivered by observers who had no communication with each other, in languages that had no shared vocabulary, in traditions that were often actively hostile to each other, and in cultures that were separated by seas and by desert and by more than 100 generations of human history. The observers, in every case, described the same eyes. They described them because they had seen them. They had seen them because the eyes had been visible to them in a specific moment and had done to them what the eyes did to every observer who received their fire. The observers fell. They rose when they were permitted to rise. And they wrote down what they had seen. The writings, gathered across the traditions, constitute a single testimony to a single phenomenon. The phenomenon is the appearance of a being whose eyes, when directed at a human observer, produce the specific effect that Enoch and Longinus and John and Peter and Justinian and the Egyptian initiate and the enemies of Ashurbanipal all reported in identical terms. The being appeared in the historical moment the Christian tradition centers on, as Jesus of Nazareth. The being appeared in the historical moments other traditions centered on, in the forms those traditions were prepared to receive. But the eyes were the same eyes. And what the Book of Enoch preserved, in chapter 14, in the passage that Charles softened, and that Isaac restored, and that Bruce refused to publish, and that Justin Martyr paraphrased, and that Athanasius said could not be publicly read, is the description of the eyes that would appear 700 years after the composition of the passage. In the face of a man born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, Executed under Pontius Pilate in the year the Roman scribes recorded as either 33 or 34 of the Common Era, and seen by a soldier of the 10th Legion Fretensis, who filed a deposition that has been unread in the Vatican's secret archive since 1901. The description matches. The eyes are the same eyes. And the book that preserved the description is on a shelf in Oxford, with a note in the margin, in Latin, in the hand of the man who brought it out of Ethiopia in 1773. Hoc est quod dixit Longinus. This is what Longinus said. The book is there. The margin note is there. The eyes it describes are the eyes of the being who walked among men in Galilee, the eyes of the one on the throne, the eyes of the Son of Man, the eyes that were fire, the eyes that men could not hold their stare against. The story ends where it began. In a locked storage room at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, on a shelf that requires 2 separate authorizations to access, there is a codex bound in leather. It was catalogued in 1773 by a Scottish traveler named James Bruce. It contains, in the 14th chapter, 22 lines of Giez text, describing a throne room, a figure seated upon a throne, and a set of eyes that no created being could withstand. It contains, in the margin of that page, a note in Latin in the hand of James Bruce. The note reads, Hoc est quod dixit Longinus. This is what Longinus said. Longinus was a Roman soldier of the 10th Legion Fretensis. He served at Golgotha in the year 33 or 34 of the Common Era. He filed a deposition describing what he saw when the prisoner in the middle position on the crosses opened his eyes and looked at him. The deposition survives in a Latin copy in the Vatican Secret Archive under the classification designation Fondo Miscellanea Armadio VII, Volume 42. It has been unread by any scholar since 1901. The description in the deposition matches, phrase for phrase, the description in the Giez manuscript on the shelf in Oxford. The 2 texts describe the same eyes. The eyes belong to the being who, in the traditions of every ancient culture that has left a written record of an encounter with the highest divine principle, was described in the same terms. The Egyptian priests at Saqqara, the Assyrian scribes at Nineveh, the Jewish visionary tradition in the Aramaic Book of the Watchers, the Christian tradition in the Greek of Revelation, the Byzantine imperial correspondence in the letter of Justinian II, the Cappadocian elders in the tradition preserved by John of Damascus, the medieval Jewish mystical tradition in the Hebrew of 3rd Enoch. Every tradition described the same eyes, because every tradition had seen the same eyes. And what the traditions described, taken together, is the description of the eyes of the being who walked among men in the 1st century of the Common Era, was called Jesus of Nazareth by those who followed him, was executed under Pontius Pilate, was seen after his death by disciples, who could not believe what they were seeing, was seen on Patmos in a vision that produced in the visionary the same fall that Enoch had experienced in the throne room 7 centuries earlier. The eyes were fire. The fire reached the observer. The observer fell. What fell before the eyes was not merely the observer. What fell was every framework of understanding the observer had brought to the moment of the encounter. Because the eyes exceeded the frameworks. They exceed the framework of the Christian canon that removed the book describing them. They exceed the framework of the modern scholarly disciplines that have kept the manuscripts describing them in separate collections and have not systematically read them together. They exceed the framework of any theology or historical reconstruction that attempts to place them. They are the eyes that men, for 3,000 years, have consistently reported they could not hold their stare against. The Book of Enoch, in chapter 14, described them. The book is on the shelf. The description is in the book. And the eyes are the eyes of the one who walked among men in Galilee and was called the Son of Man.